Suddenly, something caught my eye up ahead. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear crossing the road. But as we got closer, I realized this was way too big to be any normal animal. My heart started racing as I slowed the truck down, trying to process what I was seeing. There, not more than 10 feet in front of us, was this massive ape-like creature loping across the highway. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. The way it moved was so bizarre, kind of hunched over with its long arms nearly touching the ground, almost like a gorilla. But this was no gorilla. This thing was huge, way bigger than any primate I'd ever seen. "Holy shit! Do you see that?" I yelled to Jack. He was frozen, mouth hanging open in shock. The creature's head whipped around to look at us as it ran. Even in the darkness, I could make out its face. It looked almost human-like, but with a pronounced brow and wide, flat nose. Its eyes reflected our headlights for a split second before it disappeared into the woods on the other side of the road. The whole thing probably only lasted 5 or 6 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Jack and I just sat there in stunned silence for a minute, trying to wrap our heads around what we'd just witnessed. Did we just see Bigfoot?" Jack finally stammered. I didn't know how to respond. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to cryptids and conspiracy theories. But I know what I saw, and there's no way that was a bear or any other known animal. It was just too big, too human-like in its movements. We pulled over to the side of the road, still in shock. I half expected to see other cars stopped, other people freaking out about what had just crossed the highway, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out in both directions. As we sat there trying to process everything, another car came speeding down the highway from the opposite direction. It was going way too fast and swerved at the last second, narrowly missing the spot where the creature had just been. The driver probably never even realized how close they came to hitting whatever that thing was. After a few minutes, we decided to keep driving. But I couldn't shake this feeling of unreality, like I'd just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Jack and I kept going over every detail, trying to make sense of it. The height, the fur, the way it moved. It all pointed to one impossible conclusion. When we got back to town, I was sure we'd hear something on the local news. A Bigfoot sighting this clear, this close to the road. Surely other people must have seen it too. But there was nothing. No reports, no other witnesses coming forward. It was like it never happened. In the days that followed, I scoured the internet for any mention of a sighting in our area. I even anonymously called the local police to see if anyone had reported anything unusual. But there was just nothing. The silence around the whole thing was almost as unsettling as the encounter itself. How could something that big, that strange, cross a major highway without anyone else noticing? It made me start to doubt my own memory, wonder if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I'd talk to Jack, and he'd reaffirm everything we saw. We weren't crazy. This really happened. It's been months now, and I still think about that night all the time. Every time I drive down that stretch of Highway 26, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking figure emerge from the shadows. I've become obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings, comparing our experience to other encounters people have reported. The thing that sticks with me the most is the eyes. In that brief moment when it looked at us, there was an intelligence there, a consciousness. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. Whatever we saw that night, it was aware. It knew we were watching it. I've struggled with whether or not to share this story publicly. Part of me is afraid of the ridicule, of people thinking I'm just another crackpot making up stories. But I know what I saw, and I can't shake the feeling that by staying silent, I'm somehow betraying the significance of that encounter. So I'm putting this out there, hoping that maybe someone else saw something that night. or that someone who's had a similar experience will reach out. Because the idea that there are things out there, unknown creatures living right alongside us, is both terrifying and exhilarating. That night on Highway 26 shook my entire worldview. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And while part of me wishes I could go back to my comfortable skepticism, I know that's impossible now. Once you've seen something like that with your own eyes, there's no going back. I find myself returning to that stretch of road often, hoping for another glimpse, hoping for some kind of confirmation or explanation. But so far there's been nothing, just the quiet forest and the empty highway. But I know what's out there now, and I'll never look at those woods the same way again. The experience has left me with so many questions. Why haven't there been more sightings in that area? Is it possible that these creatures are intelligent enough to actively avoid human contact most of the time? And if so, what made this one take such a risk by crossing a major highway? I've become hyper-aware of every unusual sound when I'm in the woods now. Every snapped twig or rustling bush makes me wonder, is it back? Are there more of them out there? The not knowing is almost worse than the encounter itself. Jack and I have talked about setting up trail cameras in that area, trying to capture some evidence, but part of me is afraid of what we might find. And another part wonders if maybe it's better not to know, to leave some mystery in the world. All I know for sure is that my perception of reality has been fundamentally altered. I used to think I had a pretty good understanding of the world around me. Now I realize how little we truly know. There are things out there beyond our understanding, living right alongside us, and that both terrifies and amazes me. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this a year ago, I probably would have laughed it off. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that moment when our eyes met, human and something not quite human, on that dark stretch of Highway 26. Story 2. I was always fascinated by cryptids and unexplained phenomena, especially the legend of Bigfoot. So when I managed to convince my skeptical friends to join me on a camping trip in the Oregon Cascade Range back in August 2008, I was thrilled. Little did I know that this expedition would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. We set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, driving deep into the wilderness along winding forest roads. I had researched sighting reports extensively and pinpointed an isolated spot along the Calawash River that seemed promising. As we bumped along in my buddy's old Jeep, I could sense the others were less than enthusiastic about my chosen destination. "Are you sure about this place?" my friend Jake asked nervously as we passed the last signs of civilization. "Seems pretty remote." I assured him it was perfect, far from hiking trails or campsites where we might be disturbed. Plus, it was near several reported Bigfoot encounters from over the years. The further we got from town, the more my excitement grew. This could be my chance to finally gather some real evidence. We arrived at the secluded riverside spot in the early afternoon. A light mist hung over the water as we unloaded our gear and set up camp. While the others got a fire going, I scouted the surrounding area, looking for any signs of large bipedal creatures. Nothing jumped out at me, but the dense forest beyond our clearing had an eerie quality that sent a slight shiver down my spine. As night fell, we huddled around the campfire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. I tried explaining some of the most compelling Bigfoot evidence to my friends, but they just rolled their eyes. "Give it a rest, man," laughed Sarah. "We're here to relax, not go on some wild goose chase." I let it drop, not wanting to annoy them further. But as we turned in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there in the darkness. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a loud, reverberating sound echoing through the trees. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. A deep, resonant knocking, like someone striking a hollow log. My heart began to race as I remembered reading about wood knocking as a common form of Bigfoot communication. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the inky blackness. The knocking came again, this time from a different direction. It was definitely moving. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands, torn between excitement and fear. Just as I was about to wake the others, an earth-shaking roar split the night. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal, more like a cross between a lion's roar and a man's bellow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound reverberated through the forest. "What the hell was that?" Jake's panicked voice came from the next tent over. "I don't know," I whispered back, my mouth dry. "But I think we should stay put." We huddled in our tents, hardly daring to breathe as more strange noises drifted through the camp. Branches snapping underfoot, low, rumbling growls, the splash of something large entering the river. It felt like we were surrounded. None of us slept a wink for the rest of the night. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees, an uneasy silence settled over the forest. We emerged from our tents, wild-eyed and on edge. "What happened last night?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaky. "Those sounds, they weren't normal." I started to explain my theories, but Jake cut me off. "I don't care what it was, I just want to get out of here. Now." We hurriedly broke camp, stuffing gear into backpacks with little care. I pleaded with them to at least look around for tracks or other evidence, but they were having none of it. As we piled into the jeep, I took one last longing look at the river, wondering what secrets it held. We had barely started down the bumpy forest road when something made me yell for Jake to stop. There, about 50 yards ahead of us, a massive dark shape was lumbering across the road. Time seemed to stand still as we all gaped in stunned silence. The creature was easily 9 or 10 feet tall, covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its movements were fluid and purposeful as it strode on 2 legs, swinging muscular arms that hung below its knees. In the space of a few heartbeats, it had crossed the road and vanished into the thick undergrowth. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds, but the image was seared into my brain. Did you guys see that?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded mutely, her face drained of color. Jake just gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. "We need to go back," I said urgently. "It might have left tracks." To my shock, Jake actually agreed. We cautiously approached the spot where the creature had crossed. Sure enough, there in the soft dirt at the road's edge was a single, massive footprint. I'd seen plaster casts of alleged Bigfoot prints before, but nothing could have prepared me for the real thing. It was easily 18 inches long and half as wide, with distinct toe impressions. The depth of the print spoke to the incredible weight of whatever had made it. "We have to document this," I said, digging frantically in my pack for my camera. "This could be the proof we need." But my excitement was short-lived. As I snapped photos, the others grew increasingly agitated. "We need to leave, now." Jake's tone brooked no argument. "I don't know what that thing was, but I don't want to be here if it comes back." I begged them to let me try to make a plaster cast, but they were too freaked out. Before I knew it, we were speeding down the mountain, leaving behind what might have been the scientific discovery of the century. The ride home was tense and mostly silent. I could tell the others were struggling to rationalize what we'd seen. By the time we hit cell service again, they had convinced themselves it must have been a bear or some other known animal. "The mind plays tricks when you're scared," Sarah said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "It probably wasn't as big as it seemed." But I knew what I'd seen. That creature was no bear, no known animal. Its proportions, its gait, its sheer presence. It could only have been one thing. Bigfoot. Sasquatch, the elusive man-ape of the Pacific Northwest. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over my photos and notes, trying to make sense of our encounter. The footprint photos were compelling, but without a proper cast, they weren't enough to convince the scientific community. And my friends, perhaps out of fear or denial, slowly began to downplay the whole experience. But I know the truth. Something is out there in those mountains. Something big. Something unknown to science. That August night changed my life forever, leaving me with more questions than answers. I often find myself looking to the forests, wondering when I'll get another chance to unravel the mystery of Bigfoot. Story 3. I was out bow hunting last weekend, like I've done countless times before. It was late October, and the air had that crisp autumn chill that always gets me excited for deer season. I'd been scouting this particular spot for weeks, watching the deer patterns and waiting for the perfect day to set up my stand. As an experienced hunter, I knew the importance of choosing the right location. I found a spot between two well-worn deer trails, figuring it would give me the best chance of catching a buck crossing between them. I climbed up into my tree stand about 20 feet off the ground and settled in for what I hoped would be a productive evening hunt. The woods were peaceful as the sun began to set. I could hear squirrels scurrying through the fallen leaves and birds calling out their last songs of the day. I stayed perfectly still, bow at the ready, eyes and ears alert for any sign of movement. As dusk fell and the forest grew darker, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It's not uncommon to get a case of the willies when you're alone in the woods at night, so I tried to shake it off. But there was something different about this feeling, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. That's when I heard it, heavy footsteps crunching through the forest behind me. At first, I assumed it was a deer approaching, albeit a large one based on how loud the footfalls were. I slowly turned my head, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook my quarry. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. Emerging from the shadows was a massive, dark figure. As it got closer, I realized with growing horror that this was no deer. This thing was walking on two legs, and it was enormous, easily 11 or 12 feet tall. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of bear? But bears don't walk upright like that. A person in a costume, maybe. But no human could be that size. As it came into clearer view, I felt my blood run cold. The creature was covered in thick, shaggy black fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in huge hands with what looked like sharp claws. The shoulders were impossibly broad, at least 4 feet across. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Beneath a sloping, ape-like brow were two glowing eyes that seemed to radiate intelligence. They were fixed directly on me. I sat frozen in my stand, hardly daring to breathe. My bow hung limply at my side. I knew it would be useless against something of this size. The creature stood motionless about 70 feet away, just staring at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in each other's gaze. It felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, almost imperceptibly, it started to sway back and forth. The movement was oddly graceful for something so large. I remained paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Should I try to climb down? Make a sound to scare it off? Before I could decide, the creature suddenly turned and walked back the way it came, disappearing into the darkening forest as silently as it had appeared. For several minutes after it left, I sat trembling in my stand, straining my ears for any sound of its return. But the woods were quiet once again, as if nothing had happened. Eventually, I gathered the courage to climb down and make my way back to my truck. I've never moved so quickly through the forest in my life, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every snapping twig. When I got home, I poured myself a stiff drink and tried to process what I'd seen. I've been hunting these woods for over 20 years, and I've never encountered anything like that before. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear on everything I hold dear that this really happened. The next day, I went back to check for tracks or any other evidence, but the forest floor was undisturbed. No giant footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that a 600-pound beast had passed through. If it weren't for the vivid memories seared into my brain, I might have convinced myself it was all a hallucination brought on by too many hours in the stand. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters, trying to find some explanation for what I saw. Bigfoot sightings, while rare, aren't unheard of in this area, but most descriptions don't match the sheer size and intelligence I witnessed. This thing was massive, far larger than any known primate, and those eyes, they seemed almost human in their depth and awareness. I haven't been back to that spot since, and to be honest, I'm not sure I'll ever hunt there again. The encounter has shaken me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or believe. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the overwhelming sense of fear and awe I felt in that moment, and I know it was real. Whatever I saw out there that evening was no figment of my imagination. It was flesh and blood, as real as you or me. I've debated whether or not to share this experience publicly. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story a few weeks ago, I would have laughed it off as a tall tale. But I feel compelled to speak out, if only to warn other hunters and hikers to be cautious. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. Since that day, I've struggled with nightmares and a constant feeling of unease. Every time I step into the forest now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive, dark figure emerge again. It's changed the way I view nature and my place in it. I don't know what that creature was, or why it chose to reveal itself to me that day. Was it merely curious about the strange human perched in its forest? Or did it have more sinister intentions that were interrupted? These questions haunt me, along with the memory of those piercing, intelligent eyes. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who relies on facts and evidence. But this experience has forced me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that science can't yet explain. It's both terrifying and humbling to realize how little we truly know about the wilderness that surrounds us. For now, I'm left with more questions than answers. All I can do is share my story and hope that it might help shed light on whatever is out there. To anyone reading this who spends time in the backcountry, stay alert, stay safe, and remember that not everything in nature can be easily categorized or understood. There are mysteries in the wild places of the world, and sometimes those mysteries reveal themselves in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. Story 4. I'll never forget that summer of '95. I was 16, working my first job as a camp counselor near the Molelo River. It was supposed to be a fun gig, hanging with kids, teaching outdoor skills, goofing off. But one day changed everything. It was about midway through the summer session. The kids were off doing an activity with the other counselors, so I took the chance to grab a quick solo lunch break. I hiked a little ways from the main camp to this clearing I'd found. Nice sunny spot with a fallen log to sit on. I unpacked my sandwich and started eating, enjoying the peace and quiet. The woods were alive with bird calls and rustling leaves. Everything seemed so normal. Then I heard it, a loud snap of a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I froze mid-bite, my senses suddenly on high alert. At first I thought maybe it was a deer or something, but then came heavy footsteps. Way too heavy for a deer. I slowly turned to look over my shoulder, my heart pounding. And there it was, about 50 feet away at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy brown fur. For a split second I thought maybe it was a bear. But no, this thing was standing upright on 2 legs. And its face, God, its face. It was like a cross between an ape and a human, with dark, intelligent eyes. We just stared at each other, both equally shocked. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. This creature, this Bigfoot, I guess, seemed almost as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Its eyes were so expressive, I could see the shock and uncertainty there. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, it moved. And holy shit, the power in its movements. It turned and started running back into the woods, each step shaking the ground. The sounds of snapping branches echoed through the forest as it crashed away. I don't know how long I sat there after it disappeared, trying to process what I'd just seen. My sandwich lay forgotten on the ground where I'd dropped it. Eventually, I got up on shaky legs and booked it back to camp. I debated whether to tell anyone. Would they even believe me? I was just a teenager. They'd probably think I was making it up for attention or something, so I kept quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The rest of that summer was a blur. I went through the motions, doing my counselor duties, but I was distracted. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that creature again. At night, lying in my bunk, I'd replay the encounter over and over. Those eyes haunted me, so human-like, filled with intelligence and emotion. What was that thing? Where did it come from? Were there more of them out there? I started doing research when I got home after camp ended. I read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings and theories. So much of it lined up with what I saw, the height, the fur, the way it moved. But a lot of it seemed like crackpot conspiracy stuff too. The thing is, what I saw was real. I know it with every fiber of my being. This wasn't some guy in a costume or my imagination running wild. The raw power of that creature, the intelligence in its eyes. There's no faking that. For years I've debated whether to share this story. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if someone else told me this, I'd be skeptical too. But I can't keep it bottled up anymore. That day changed my life. I still go camping and hiking, but I'm always on edge in the woods now. Every shadow, every snapped twig puts me on high alert. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself I'm not crazy. But mostly I'm terrified of another encounter. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. Does it tell its Bigfoot family about the day it saw a strange human kid eating lunch in the woods? Did our chance encounter impact its life as much as it did mine? I'll probably never know the answers. But I know what I saw that day was real. And it's made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and what might be out there, hidden just beyond our view. To this day, I can't explain it. How could a creature like that exist without definitive proof? Why aren't there more sightings, more evidence? But then I remember those eyes, that immense presence, and I know deep in my bones that it was real. I've never been back to that specific spot in the woods. Part of me wants to return, to see if there's any trace left behind. But mostly I'm afraid of finding nothing and doubting my memory, but also afraid of encountering that creature again. The experience has left me with a mix of wonder and fear about the natural world. There's so much we don't understand, so much that could be out there that we haven't discovered yet. It's humbling and terrifying at the same time. I still work with kids, but now as a teacher. Sometimes when we do nature units, I'm tempted to share my story, but I always hold back. How do you tell kids that the world might be full of things beyond our understanding without scaring them? Instead, I try to instill a sense of wonder about nature. I encourage them to explore, but also to respect the wilderness and its mysteries. And secretly, I hope that maybe one of them will have their own incredible encounter someday, something that opens their eyes to the vast unknown that surrounds us. As the years have passed, the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's become more vivid. I can still see every detail of that creature, the way its fur moved in the breeze, the steam of its breath in the cool air, the way its muscles rippled as it ran. I've heard other Bigfoot stories since then, read countless accounts online. Some sound plausible, others completely far-fetched. But I always come back to my own experience. I know what I saw, and I know that out there, in the vast wilderness, there are things that defy explanation. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever have closure. Will there ever be definitive proof of Bigfoot's existence? Or will it remain a mystery, with only scattered sightings and blurry photos to fuel the debate? All I know is that my life was forever changed by those few seconds in the woods. It opened my eyes to the possibility that our world is far stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. And while that's terrifying in many ways, it's also incredibly exciting. So I keep watching, keep listening. Every time I'm in nature, there's a part of me that's on alert, wondering if today will be the day I see it again. Because now I know that sometimes, just sometimes, the legends turn out to be real. Story 5. That particular weekend started off normal enough. We arrived Friday evening, unpacked the car, and settled in for a relaxing night by the fireplace. Our 2 dogs, Max and Duke, were with us as always. They loved running around in the woods and chasing squirrels. Saturday morning, we woke up early to go for a hike. There was still some patchy snow on the ground from a late spring storm the week before. As we were having coffee on the porch, I noticed Max and Duke acting strangely. They kept pacing back and forth, whining and staring intently at the tree line about 50 yards from the cabin. I figured they had picked up the scent of a deer or something. We set off on our hike around 9 a.m. The dogs were still on edge, constantly looking around and sniffing the air. About a mile in, I caught a whiff of something absolutely foul, like rotting meat mixed with garbage. I assumed it was just a dead animal nearby, but the smell seemed to follow us for a while before fading. On the way back, my wife stopped suddenly and grabbed my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a gap between 2 large pines about 100 feet away. I squinted, trying to see what she was looking at. Then I saw it, a large, dark shape moving through the trees. At first I thought it was a bear, but something seemed off about the way it moved. It was upright, almost like a person, but much bigger and covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. We stood frozen, watching as this thing lumbered between the trees, clearly trying to stay out of sight. The dogs were going absolutely nuts, barking and growling. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds or so, the creature disappeared deeper into the forest. My wife and I looked at each other, both pale and shaken. "What the hell was that?" she asked. I had no answer. We hurried back to the cabin, constantly looking over our shoulders. That night, neither of us could sleep. Every little noise outside made us jump. The dogs were restless too, pacing and whining. Around 2 a.m., we heard a series of loud wood-knocking sounds coming from the forest. It sounded like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat, but much louder. This went on for about 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. The next morning, we decided to investigate the area where we had seen the creature. As we approached, that horrible stench hit us again, even stronger than before. Then we saw them, a line of massive footprints in a patch of remaining snow. They were easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. Whatever made them was walking on 2 legs. I took some photos and measurements, my hands shaking the whole time. The stride length between prints was over 5 feet. No bear or other animal I knew of could make tracks like these. As we were examining the prints, Max suddenly took off into the woods, barking furiously. We called for him to come back, but he was on a mission. After about 5 minutes of frantic barking in the distance, we heard a yelp and then silence. My heart sank. We spent the next hour searching for Max, calling his name and whistling. Finally, we heard a faint whimpering. We found him limping back towards us, favoring his right front leg. There was a gash on his shoulder, about 4 inches long. It looked like claw marks, but much bigger than anything a typical predator in the area could inflict. We rushed Max to the vet in the nearest town. They cleaned and stitched his wound, saying it looked like he had been attacked by a large animal, possibly a bear. But I knew it wasn't a bear we had seen in those woods. Over the next few months, we returned to the cabin several times. Each visit, there would be some kind of strange occurrence, more wood knocks, eerie howls in the night, and that awful smell. We never saw the creature clearly again, but sometimes we'd catch glimpses of something large moving through the trees in the distance. The final straw came in October of that year. We arrived at the cabin one Friday evening to find the porch absolutely destroyed. The railing was smashed to pieces, and there were deep claw marks gouged into the wooden pillars. Inside, furniture had been overturned and the kitchen ransacked. But strangest of all, nothing was actually stolen or eaten. It was like something had torn the place apart out of pure rage. That was it for us. We sold the cabin the following spring and never went back to that part of Mount Hood. To this day, I have no explanation for what we experienced that summer. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and always been skeptical, but after what we went through, I'm not so sure anymore. Whatever it was out there in those woods, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal. The image of that massive hair-covered shape moving through the trees still haunts my dreams sometimes. I don't know if it was truly a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, but I know what I saw, and I know I never want to see it again. Story 6. I was just a kid back in the summer of '78, but I'll never forget that camping trip in the Willamette National Forest. My dad was big into hunting and outdoor survival, so he'd take me and my older brother out to the woods for weeks at a time. This particular trip started off normal enough. We hiked deep into the forest, set up our tents by a creek, and spent the first few days fishing and foraging. It was on the 4th night that things got weird. I woke up around 2 a.m. to take a leak, and as I was stumbling out of the tent, I heard this low, guttural sound echoing through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. My first thought was maybe a bear, but this was different. It sent chills down my spine. I tried to wake up my dad and brother, but they were both sound asleep. As I stood there debating what to do, I noticed movement at the edge of our campsite. There was just enough moonlight filtering through the trees that I could make out a massive, dark shape. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like shaggy fur. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I was frozen in place. The creature took a step forward, and I could see its eyes reflecting in the dim light. They were huge and seemed almost intelligent, not animal-like at all. Suddenly, it let out another of those bone-chilling vocalizations. This time, it was loud enough to wake my dad and brother. They came stumbling out of the tent, and in that split second of commotion, the creature turned and melted back into the darkness of the forest. My dad grabbed his rifle and flashlight, but by the time we got our wits about us, there was no sign of whatever I'd seen. Just the usual nighttime forest sounds. Of course, they didn't believe me at first. My brother teased me about having a nightmare, and my dad tried to chalk it up to shadows and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. The next morning, we found massive footprints in the soft dirt around our campsite. They were easily 15 inches long and shaped like a human foot, but much wider. My dad just stared at them, his face pale. He'd been a hunter in these woods for 30 years and said he'd never seen anything like it. We packed up and hiked out that same day. My dad was on edge the whole time, constantly scanning the trees and gripping his rifle. I'd never seen him so rattled. When we got back to civilization, we heard rumors of other sightings in the area, hikers and campers reporting strange noises and glimpses of a large, ape-like creature. Some folks called it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch. Whatever it was, I know it was real. That wasn't the last weird experience I had in those woods either. A few years later, in the summer of '82, I was back in the Willamette with some high school buddies. We were goofing off, drinking beers by the river, when we heard that same haunting vocalization echoing through the trees. Everyone froze, and I felt that same icy fear creep up my spine. We didn't see anything that time, but later that night, something huge moved through our campsite. It was pitch black, but we could hear heavy footsteps and branches snapping. The next morning, we found our cooler smashed to pieces about 50 yards from camp. Whatever did it had to be incredibly strong. My friend Mike swore he saw glowing eyes watching us from the tree line just before dawn. We hightailed it out of there and didn't go back for the rest of the summer. I've talked to other locals over the years who've had similar experiences. There was old Bill, who lived up near Detroit Lake. He told me about a night in '75 when something tried to break into his cabin, said it was pounding on the walls and roof so hard he thought the whole place might come down. When he finally worked up the courage to look out the window, he saw this massive, hair-covered arm reaching for the door handle. Then there was the group of college kids who went camping near Sweet Home in the early '80s. They said they were stalked through the woods for hours by something big that stayed just out of sight. They kept finding broken branches and strange hair caught on trees. One girl swore she saw a face peering at them from behind a boulder, a face that was definitely not human. I've heard dozens of stories like that over the years, all centered around the forests of western Oregon. Some folks think it's all just tall tales and overactive imaginations, but I know what I saw that night back in '78. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. I still go camping and hunting in the Willamette from time to time. Can't let fear keep you from living your life, you know. But I'd be lying if I said I don't get a little on edge when the sun goes down and the forest gets quiet. Every snapping twig or rustling bush makes me wonder, is it back? Is it watching me right now? I've never had another encounter as clear as that first one, but there have been moments. A glimpse of movement just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Strange tracks in the mud that don't quite match any known animal. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck like I'm being watched. One time, about 5 years ago, I was bow hunting for elk near the Santiam River. I'd been sitting in my blind for hours when I heard what sounded like wood knocking in the distance. It was a distinct pattern. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more knocks. It repeated a few times, moving closer each time. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely nock an arrow. I was trying to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just another hunter or maybe a woodpecker. But deep down, I knew. It was the same feeling I'd had as a kid, that bone-deep certainty that something unnatural was nearby. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a long moment the forest was dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Then I heard heavy footsteps approaching my blind. Whatever it was big and it was coming right for me. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped right outside the blind. I could hear deep, huffing breaths. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a minute or two. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest sounds slowly returned to normal. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out of the blind, there was nothing there, but the ground all around was torn up, like something massive had been pacing back and forth. And the trees, several small trees had been snapped in half like twigs. I packed up and got the hell out of there. Didn't even bother breaking down my blind, just left everything and ran. I haven't been back to that specific spot since. Look, I know how this all sounds. Believe me, there have been plenty of times I've tried to convince myself it was all just my imagination. But I know what I've seen and heard over the years. There's something out there in the forests of Oregon. Something big, something intelligent, and something that doesn't want to be found. I don't know if it's Bigfoot or Sasquatch or some unknown species of ape. Hell, maybe it's something we don't even have a name for yet. All I know is that it's real, and it's out there. And if you spend enough time in those woods, sooner or later, you might just run into it yourself. So if you're ever camping in the Willamette or hiking through the Cascades and you hear strange noises in the night or feel like you're being watched, well, maybe think twice before writing it off as just your imagination, because sometimes the monsters in the dark are all too real. Story 7. As we came to a stop in the driveway, I glanced over towards the telephone pole at the edge of our property. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape, partially hidden behind the pole. At first, my tired brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was so tall, with impossibly broad shoulders, and it was completely motionless, like a statue. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it seemed to be staring right at us. I opened my mouth to say something to my husband, but no words came out. I was frozen. "Come on, let's get the kids inside," my husband mumbled sleepily, already climbing out of the car. He hadn't noticed anything amiss. I wanted to tell him to wait, to look over by the pole. But a primal fear had taken hold of me. Some instinct was screaming at me to get my family inside as quickly and quietly as possible. So I just nodded mutely and helped him gather up our sleeping children. As we hurried towards the front door, I could feel eyes boring into my back. I didn't dare turn around to look. My hands shook as I fumbled with the house key. It felt like an eternity before we were finally inside with the door locked behind us. I spent the rest of that night lying awake, straining my ears for any sound of movement outside. But there was nothing, just the usual nighttime noises of crickets and rustling leaves. When dawn finally broke, I was almost convinced I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. As soon as it was light out, I went to investigate the area by the telephone pole. What I found chilled me to the bone. There was a slight depression in the ground where the creature had been standing, and it was easily 2 feet deep. Whatever had been there was impossibly tall and heavy. I tried to tell myself it must have been a bear or something, but I knew deep down that wasn't the case. Bears don't stand motionless for hours, and they certainly don't have such a distinctly human-like silhouette. For months afterwards, I was on edge every time I went outside after dark. I kept expecting to see that hulking shape again, watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing. Then winter came, bringing with it a heavy snowfall. As I was shoveling our driveway one morning, I noticed something odd near the tree line, a series of enormous footprints in the fresh snow. My blood ran cold as I approached them for a closer look. They were bipedal prints, but far larger than any human foot. Each one was easily 18 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever had made them must have been incredibly heavy, and they led right up to our property line before veering off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to follow them, to finally get some answers about what was out there, but a much bigger part of me was terrified of what I might find. In the end, I hurried back inside and pretended I hadn't seen anything. I didn't even tell my husband. What would I have said? That I thought Bigfoot was stalking our property. He would have thought I was going crazy. But I know what I saw that night by the telephone pole. And I know those footprints were real. There's something out there in the wilderness of Vancouver Island. something huge and inexplicable. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps circling our house. I've never talked about this before now. For years, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But I can't keep pretending anymore. I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar, because the truth is, I'm still scared. Every time I step outside after dark, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive silhouette watching me again. I don't know what it was, or why it was there that night, but I do know that it changed me forever. I used to love the wilderness, but now I see danger lurking in every shadow. I jump at every twig snap and rustle of leaves, and I can never shake the feeling that we're not alone out here, that there's something ancient and unknowable sharing these woods with us. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better never to have seen it at all, to have just gone about my life in blissful ignorance. But I can't unsee what I saw, and I can't unknow what I know. All I can do is stay vigilant and hope that whatever it was doesn't decide to pay us another visit. Because the truth is, I don't think I could handle seeing it again. That brief glimpse was enough to haunt me for a lifetime. The sheer size of it, the uncanny stillness, the sense of raw power and intelligence radiating from it. It was like nothing of this earth. And deep down, I'm terrified that one day I'll look out my window and see those eyes staring back at me once again. So I keep the curtains drawn at night. I double-check the locks before bed, and I pray to whatever higher power might be listening that my family stays safe. Because I know now that there are things out there in the dark, things that defy explanation and challenge everything we think we know about the world. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if maybe ignorance really is bliss. Because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The world becomes a much scarier, more mysterious place, and you realize just how small and vulnerable we really are in the face of the unknown. But I can't change what happened. All I can do is share my story and hope that maybe, just maybe, it will help someone else who's experienced something similar, because I know now that I'm not alone. There are others out there who have seen things they can't explain, things that lurk on the fringes of our reality. So if you're reading this and you've had your own encounter with the unexplained, know that you're not crazy. There really are things out there beyond our understanding, and while that knowledge can be terrifying, it can also be strangely liberating. Because once you accept that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we've been led to believe, suddenly anything becomes possible. Just be careful out there. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something you can't explain, trust your instincts. Run if you have to, hide if you must. But above all, never forget what you saw, because the truth is out there, even if sometimes we wish it wasn't. Story 8. I remember we had the heater cranked all the way up, but could still see our breath inside the car. Tom and Mike were dozing off in the back, but I was wide awake, hyped up on coffee, and determined to make it to our hotel before sunrise. The headlights cut through the pitch-black night, illuminating the empty road ahead and occasional reflective signs warning of wildlife crossings. Suddenly, something massive stepped out onto the road about 50 yards ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as we got closer, I realized this thing was walking on 2 legs. It was enormous, had to be 7 or 8 feet tall at least. The body was bulky but distinctly humanoid, with long arms hanging down past its knees. As the headlights hit it full on, I could make out more details. The whole body was covered in thick, matted grey fur. The torso was incredibly broad and muscular. But what struck me most was the way it moved. There was a fluidity to its gait that seemed almost ape-like, yet far more powerful than any primate I'd ever seen. I instinctively hit the brakes, slowing the car as we approached. Tom and Mike jolted awake, confused at first, but then going dead silent as they spotted the creature. It had paused in the middle of the road and was now turning to look directly at our approaching vehicle. The way it turned was unlike anything I've ever seen before or since. Its entire body rotated as one unit, pivoting smoothly at the waist. There was no separate movement of the neck or shoulders like you'd expect from a human or animal. The head stayed perfectly aligned with the torso as it swiveled to face us. In that moment, illuminated by our headlights, I locked eyes with the creature. Its face was a mix of ape-like and human features, a pronounced brow ridge, wide flat nose, and a somewhat recessed chin. But the eyes, they had an unmistakable intelligence behind them. This was no animal. There was a sentience there that chilled me to my core. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we stared at each other. I felt rooted to my seat, unable to look away or even blink. Then, without warning, the creature turned and bounded off the road with incredible speed. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thick forest, leaving no trace behind. I don't know how long we sat there in stunned silence after it vanished. Eventually, Mike's shaky voice from the back seat snapped me out of it. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his tone a mix of awe and fear. Tom just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over in a whisper. I put the car back in drive, and we continued on, all thoughts of sleep forgotten. We spent the rest of the trip debating what we'd seen. A bear walking on its hind legs, some kind of escaped gorilla. But deep down, we all knew those explanations didn't fit. What we'd encountered was something else entirely. As we neared Vancouver, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The normal bustle of the city felt surreal after our experience in the isolated wilderness. We checked into our hotel in a daze, barely speaking to each other. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, so human-like, yet so alien at the same time. The intelligence I saw there haunted me. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal. Whatever we encountered on that lonely stretch of road was something more. The ski trip was a blur. We went through the motions, but our minds were elsewhere. In quiet moments, we'd start discussing it again in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, but every attempt at a rational explanation fell short. When we got back home, we debated whether to report it to anyone. But who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. And part of me was afraid of what might happen if people took us seriously. Would the creature be hunted down, captured and studied? Somehow that felt wrong. So we kept it to ourselves, made a pact not to talk about it outside our small group. But it changed us, changed how we saw the world and our place in it. To know that something like that could exist, hidden away in the wilderness. It makes you question everything you thought you knew. Years have passed, but I still think about that night often. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if it was just some trick of light and shadow mixed with the fatigue of a long night drive. But then I remember those eyes, the intelligence I saw there, and I know it was real. I've read about other Sasquatch sightings over the years. Some sound similar to what we experienced. Others seem far-fetched. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know what I saw that night in British Columbia. And it wasn't human. The encounter lasted only moments, but it stayed with me for decades. I still get chills thinking about it. The sheer size and power of the creature, the way it moved with such unnatural grace, and those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. I've been back to that stretch of road a few times over the years. Always in daylight, always with a mixture of hope and fear. Part of me wants to see it again, to prove to myself it was real. But another part dreads the possibility. What if it's still out there, watching and waiting? Sometimes I have nightmares about that night. In the dreams, the creature doesn't run away. Instead, it charges the car, ripping the door off and dragging me into the darkness. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. It takes me a while to convince myself I'm safe in my bed. I've never told my wife or kids about it. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. Or worse, they'd believe me and have to live with the knowledge that such things exist. It's a burden I've carried alone all these years. Tom, Mike, and I don't see each other much anymore. We've drifted apart, as old friends often do. But every few years we'll get together, have a few beers, and inevitably the conversation turns to that night. We recount the details, searching our memories for anything we might have missed, any clue that might explain what we saw. But in the end, we're left with more questions than answers. What was it? Where did it come from? Are there more out there? We'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that for a brief moment on a cold January night in 1969, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and nothing has been the same since. I still love the outdoors, still go camping and hiking when I can, but I'm always a little more alert now, especially at night. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow at the edge of the firelight makes me wonder, is it out there, watching, waiting? I'm an old man now. My adventuring days are mostly behind me, but I still find myself drawn to those remote wilderness areas. Part of me hopes for another glimpse, another chance to confirm what I saw all those years ago, but mostly I'm content to let the mystery be. Whatever it was we encountered that night, it's clear there are still things in this world beyond our understanding, hidden away in the dark corners of the map, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps waiting to discover us. As I near the end of my life, I find myself thinking about that night more and more. Was it a blessing or a curse to have seen such a thing? To know that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine? I still don't have an answer, but I know this. I'll never forget that moment when our eyes met, when I saw something ancient and powerful and utterly inhuman looking back at me. It was terrifying, yes, but also awe-inspiring in a way I can't fully describe. So I'll keep this secret, as I have for decades now. But sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls outside, I find myself looking out the window, searching the shadows for a glimpse of something impossible, and wondering if, somewhere out there in the vastness of the wilderness, it's looking back at me. Story 9. It was a crisp, clear night. The stars were out in full force, twinkling against the inky black sky. We'd driven out to a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, away from the lights. There were 4 of us crammed into my buddy's old Chevy, me, Tom, Dave, and Mike. We had our usual UFO watching gear, binoculars, a couple of flashlights, and snacks to keep us going through the night. We'd been out there for a couple hours, taking turns scanning the sky, when Dave suddenly tensed up. "Hey guys, did you hear that?" he whispered. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I didn't hear anything, but then there was a faint splashing sound coming from down the hill near the creek. "Probably just a deer or something," Tom said with a shrug. But there was an edge to his voice that betrayed his unease. "Let's check it out," I suggested, feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. We slowly got out of the car, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the area. The beams cut through the darkness, creating long shadows among the trees. As we crept closer to the edge of the hill, the splashing sounds grew louder. My heart was pounding in my chest. There was something off about those noises. They were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an animal drinking. We peered over the crest of the hill, down towards the creek below. What I saw in that moment is seared into my memory forever. There, illuminated in the car's headlights, was a massive figure crouched over the creek. It was easily 7 feet tall, even hunched over like that. The creature was covered in thick, matted grey fur. Its arms were long and powerful looking, ending in massive hands that dipped into the water. For a few seconds we all stood frozen in shock. My mind was reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. It looked for all the world like a Sasquatch, but that was impossible, right? Those were just stories, myths. Suddenly, as if sensing our presence, the creature's head snapped up. I caught a glimpse of a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Its eyes reflected the headlights, glowing an eerie yellow. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I could hear my friend's ragged breathing beside me. The air felt charged, electric. Then, in one fluid motion, the creature rose to its full height. It was even bigger than I'd first thought, towering and broad-shouldered. With shocking speed for something so large, it took one massive stride towards the opposite bank of the creek. We all stumbled backwards in terror. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the creature had vanished into the tree line. The silence that followed was deafening. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed and pale. Did you guys see that?" Mike finally stammered out. We all nodded mutely. There was no denying what we'd witnessed. "We need to get out of here," Tom said urgently. No one argued. We practically ran back to the car, piling in and locking the doors. Tom cranked the engine and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel. We were all breathing hard, glancing nervously out the windows as if expecting the creature to come bursting out of the woods at any moment. The drive back to town was tense and quiet. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. It defied all logic and reason. And yet, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it had been real. When we got back into town, we decided to stop at the all-night diner to try and calm our nerves. As we sat there nursing cups of coffee with shaking hands, we started to discuss what had happened. "Should we tell someone?" Dave asked. "The police, maybe?" I shook my head. Who'd believe us? They'd just think we were drunk or on drugs or something. "Yeah," Mike agreed. "We'd be laughingstocks. No one's going to buy that we saw Bigfoot." We all flinched a little at the word. It made it seem too real somehow. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe 4 teenagers claiming to have seen a Sasquatch? We'd be mocked and ridiculed. And part of me was afraid of what might happen if people did believe us. Would the creature be hunted down, captured and put in a lab somewhere? The thought made me deeply uneasy. As the night wore on and the adrenaline faded, doubt started to creep in. Had we really seen what we thought we saw? Could it have been a bear, maybe, or some other animal? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The image of that creature was burned into my mind. Its massive size, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it moved with such unnatural speed and grace. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching Sasquatch sightings and legends. I read every book I could get my hands on, scoured newspapers for similar accounts. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that what we'd seen that night was real. My friends and I drifted apart after that night. I think we all dealt with it in our own ways. Tom threw himself into his studies, barely speaking about that night again. Dave got heavily into drugs for a while, as if trying to blur the memory. Mike moved away to college, and I lost touch with him. As for me, that encounter changed the course of my life. I became fascinated with cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I've spent years researching and investigating similar sightings. I've interviewed countless witnesses and trekked through remote wilderness areas, searching for evidence. But in all these years, I've never seen anything like what I saw that night in 1969. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will again. Part of me hopes I do, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But another part of me dreads the thought of coming face to face with such a creature again. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing eyes fresh in my mind. I'll never forget that night, or the way it shattered my understanding of the world. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, creatures that defy explanation. I know that now with absolute certainty. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually to fellow researchers or at conferences, but this is the first time I've written it all down like this. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to share it now. Maybe it's because I'm getting older and I want there to be a record of what happened. Or maybe I'm hoping that someone out there has had a similar experience and will reach out. Whatever the reason, I feel a sense of relief getting it all out. For years, I've carried the weight of that night alone. Even though my friends were there, we rarely spoke of it afterwards. It was too strange, too unbelievable. But it happened. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. To this day, I can't explain what that creature was or where it came from. Was it some unknown species of primate, an interdimensional being, a relic from prehistoric times? I don't have the answers. But I know what I saw, and it's shaped every aspect of my life since then. If you're reading this, and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. There are things in this world that science can't yet explain, but that doesn't make them any less real. Keep an open mind, and never stop seeking the truth, because sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. As for me, I'll keep searching. Maybe one day I'll find the answers I've been looking for all these years. Or maybe that night in 1969 will remain a mystery forever. Either way, I know that my encounter with the unknown changed me profoundly. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's so much more to our world than we realize. And for that, despite the fear and uncertainty it's brought me, I'm grateful. Story 10. I'll never forget that summer of '73. I was just a kid, 13 years old, excited for my first time at Camp Evergreen in Langley, British Columbia. My parents thought it'd be good for me to get out in nature, make some friends. If they only knew what was waiting for us out there in those woods. The first few days were pretty normal. Canoeing, archery, roasting marshmallows. But things started to get weird when we took a day trip to Sasquatch Provincial Park. Our counselor Dave was leading us on a hike, pointing out different plants and wildlife. That's when we ran into this old guy on horseback. He looked like something out of an old Western movie, weathered face, cowboy hat, the works. Said his name was Bill, and he'd been riding these trails for decades. When Dave mentioned we were learning about local wildlife, Bill got this glint in his eye. "You kids want to see something real interesting?" he asked. We all nodded eagerly. Bill led us off the main trail a ways, then stopped in a small clearing. He dismounted and gestured for us to gather round. That's when I noticed the depression in the ground. Looked almost like a huge, shallow pit. "Know what this is?" Bill asked. We shook our heads. "This here's an old Sasquatch trap." A few kids laughed, but Bill didn't crack a smile. He went on to explain how back in the day, hunters would dig these pits and cover them with branches, hoping to catch one of the elusive creatures. "Course ain't nobody caught one yet," Bill said. "Least not around here. But there was one time." He launched into this wild story about how a Sasquatch had supposedly been captured alive somewhere up north, said they were transporting it by ship to England of all places to be studied. But during the journey, the creature broke free and escaped when they docked in Vancouver. "Some folks say it made its way out here to these forests," Bill finished with a wink. Dave laughed it off, thanking Bill for the interesting local folklore. But as we hiked back to the bus, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The way Bill had told that story, it was like he really believed it. That night back at camp, things got even weirder. We were sitting around the campfire when Dave came running up, white as a sheet. Said he'd been checking the perimeter of the camp when he heard something big moving through the woods behind him. When he turned to look, he caught a glimpse of a massive, hair-covered shape disappearing into the shadows. Most of the other kids laughed it off as Dave trying to scare us. But I saw the fear in his eyes. That wasn't an act. We all went to bed, but I had trouble falling asleep. Every little noise outside the cabin made me jump. Just as I was finally drifting off, the most horrifying sound I've ever heard ripped through the night. It was like a roar, but not quite like any animal I knew. It started low and guttural, then rose to this ear-splitting shriek that seemed to go on forever. I bolted upright in my bunk, heart pounding. The other boys were awake too, all of us frozen in terror. The roar faded, but was quickly followed by another, then another. They seemed to be coming from different directions, like there was more than one, whatever it was out there. Panic broke out in the cabin. Kids were crying, screaming to go home. I remember one boy wet himself. Our counselor tried to calm everyone down, saying it was probably just some kind of bird or something. But I could see it in his eyes. He was just as scared as we were. The noises continued on and off throughout the night. None of us got any sleep. When morning finally came, the camp director called an emergency meeting. He tried to play it cool, saying there must have been some kind of wildlife disturbance, but everything was fine now. But then one of the other counselors burst in. He'd just gotten a call from a farm down the road. 2 of their sheep had gone missing overnight. When the farmer went to check the pasture, he found blood on the barbed wire fence and enormous human-like footprints in the mud. That was it. They decided to end the camp session early and send us all home. As my parents' car pulled up later that day, I'd never been so relieved in my life. For years afterwards, I tried to convince myself it had all just been some elaborate prank. The old man's story, Dave's encounter, those terrifying roars in the night. It was too much to be real, right? But to this day, I can't explain what happened out there in those woods. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, that bone-chilling shriek echoing in my mind. Whatever was out there that summer, I hope I never encounter it again. I've never told anyone the full story before, partly because I was afraid people would think I was crazy, but mostly because even now, 50 years later, just thinking about it brings back that paralyzing fear I felt as a kid. You hear stories about Bigfoot sightings all the time, but most of them are pretty tame, just glimpses through the trees or fuzzy photos. What we experienced that night was something else entirely. It wasn't just seeing something unexplainable, it was feeling hunted, feeling like prey. The way those roars echoed through the forest, it was like they were surrounding us, closing in. And the intelligence behind it, the way they seemed to be coordinating, calling to each other from different positions. It was terrifyingly clear that whatever was out there, it wasn't just some dumb animal. I remember huddling in my bunk, clutching my flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, had me convinced that at any moment some massive, hairy arm was going to come crashing through the window. The worst part was the waiting. Those long stretches of silence between the roars were almost worse than the sounds themselves. Your mind starts playing tricks on you in the dark. Was that shadow moving outside? Did something just touch the cabin wall? When morning finally came, we were all exhausted and on edge. I remember stepping outside and being hit by this overwhelming smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It was all over the camp. As we were packing up to leave, I overheard some of the counselors talking in hushed voices. They were debating whether to call the police or some kind of wildlife service. One of them mentioned finding some strange hair caught on a tree near the edge of camp. Another swore he saw eyes reflecting in his flashlight beam when he went to check on the commotion in the night. Looking back now, I wonder why they didn't make a bigger deal out of it. Maybe they were worried about getting in trouble for putting us in danger, or maybe they just couldn't face the reality of what had happened. I tried asking my parents about it years later, but they didn't seem to remember much. Said something about a bear scare causing the camp to end early. I guess that's the story they were told. But I know what I experienced. Those weren't bear roars. And no bear I've ever heard of hunts in packs, terrorizing an entire camp like that. Sometimes I think about trying to go back there to see if I can find any traces of what happened. But honestly, I'm too scared. What if they're still out there? What if they remember us? I don't know if it was really Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it, but I know it was something beyond ordinary explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but does, and that's the thought that still keeps me up at night sometimes. If those creatures are real, what else might be out there in the dark, just waiting to be discovered? Or worse, waiting to discover us? Story 11. I was only 12 years old that summer of '74, but the memory of what happened at Lake Shaigan still haunts me to this day. My cousins and I were spending a few weeks at our grandparents' cabin on Vancouver Island, and we were always looking for ways to escape the watchful eyes of the adults and have our own adventures. One warm afternoon in late May, the five of us, me, Jenny, Kate, Molly, and Lisa, decided to sneak off into the woods while the grown-ups were busy playing cards on the porch. We told them we were just going down to the lake to swim, but we had other plans. There was an old logging trail that led deep into the forest, and we were determined to follow it as far as we dared. The woods were thick and green, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. We giggled and pushed each other as we walked, feeling so grown up and rebellious. After about 30 minutes, we came to a small clearing with a massive fallen log. It was the perfect spot for a rest, so we clambered up onto the mossy trunk. That's when we heard it, a strange, heavy rustling coming from the trees ahead. At first we thought it was just a deer or something, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, big, lumbering footsteps that made the ground vibrate ever so slightly. "Shh!" Jenny hissed, putting her finger to her lips. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps got closer and closer. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was would hear it. Then, through a gap in the foliage, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more, and it was covered in thick, matted fur from head to toe. The creature moved with an odd gait, slightly stooped but still towering. Its arms swung at its sides, freakishly long and ending in massive hands. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I just sat there, paralyzed with fear, as this thing emerged fully into view about 50 feet away from us. The smell hit me then, a rank, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat and wet dog, and something else I couldn't identify. I fought the urge to gag. For what felt like an eternity, we cowered there on that log, hardly daring to move a muscle. The creature seemed oblivious to our presence at first. It was hunched over slightly, as if examining something on the ground. Then Molly, the youngest of us at only 10, let out a tiny cough. She tried to stifle it, but in the hushed stillness of the forest, it may as well have been a gunshot. The thing's head snapped up, turning in our direction. I got my first clear look at its face, and to this day I have trouble describing what I saw. It was almost human, but not quite. The brow was heavy and pronounced, the nose flat and wide. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, deep-set and glinting with unmistakable intelligence. For a heart-stopping moment those eyes locked onto us. I was certain we were about to die. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped back into the trees, moving with surprising speed and agility for something so large. We sat there in stunned silence for several minutes, too shocked and scared to move. Finally, Lisa whispered, What was that?" Nobody had an answer. We were all shaking, tears streaming down our faces. By unspoken agreement, we scrambled off the log and ran back towards the cabin as fast as our legs could carry us. We burst out of the woods, gasping and sobbing. Our parents were furious that we'd wandered so far, but when they saw the state we were in, their anger turned to concern. "What happened? Are you girls all right?" my aunt asked, gathering us into her arms. We tried to explain what we'd seen, but our stories came out jumbled and incoherent. The adults exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking we'd just scared ourselves with an overactive imagination. "It was probably just a bear," my grandfather said soothingly. "You girls shouldn't be going that deep into the woods alone. It's not safe." But we knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk on two legs. Bears don't have almost human faces. Bears don't look at you with eyes full of ancient wisdom and unknowable secrets. That night, huddled together in the stuffy attic bedroom we shared, we swore a solemn oath never to speak of what we'd seen. Who would believe us anyway? But we also vowed never to go into those woods again. The rest of the vacation passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We went swimming, roasted marshmallows, played board games. But there was an undercurrent of tension that never quite went away. Every snapping twig, every shadow at the edge of the trees made us flinch. When it was time to go home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I thought that putting distance between myself and Lake Shaigan would make the memory fade, make it seem less real somehow. But it didn't. For weeks afterwards, I had vivid nightmares of those piercing eyes, that lumbering gait. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I could still smell that awful, musky odor. As the years went by, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just an especially large bear walking oddly. Maybe the summer heat and our overexcited imaginations had played tricks on us. But deep down, I knew the truth. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some of them bear an eerie similarity to what we experienced that day. But I've never shared my story publicly before now. Part of me is still that scared little girl, certain that nobody would believe me. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I wonder, is it still out there? Still roaming those deep, dark woods? And what would happen if our paths ever crossed again? I don't think I want to know the answer to that question. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I'll never forget that summer day by Lake Shaigan, when 5 young girls came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It changed us forever, in ways I'm still trying to understand. So if you're ever hiking in the forests of Vancouver Island and you hear heavy footsteps or catch a whiff of that distinctive odor, don't investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Just turn around and get out of there as fast as you can. Because trust me, there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Things that should remain hidden in the shadows of the ancient forests. And sometimes, ignorance really is bliss. Story 12. I still remember that summer morning like it was yesterday, even though it's been almost 50 years. July 1974. I was just a kid, 8 years old, living with my family in a house near Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. It was the kind of idyllic childhood you dream about, spending sunny days swimming in the lake, exploring the woods, and feeling completely safe and carefree. At least, that's how it was until that morning. I've always been an early riser, even as a kid. That day I woke up around 5 a.m., just as the first light of dawn was starting to creep over the mountains. The house was silent. My parents and little sister were still fast asleep. I crept downstairs, thinking I'd grab some cereal and watch cartoons before everyone else got up. As I passed by the sliding glass door that led out to our back patio, something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, or my sleepy eyes playing tricks on me. But as I moved closer to the door, I realized with growing horror that what I was seeing was very, very real. There was something out there, something huge. It was standing right up against the door, hunched over slightly so that its head just cleared the overhang of the roof. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could make out a massive dark silhouette. It looked vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too big to be human. The body was thick and muscular, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run and wake up my parents, but I was paralyzed with fear. All I could do was stare at this impossible creature, willing it to be some kind of hallucination. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its massive body 180 degrees. I caught a glimpse of its face as it turned, a face that has haunted my nightmares ever since. It was ape-like, with deep-set eyes that glinted with an unsettling intelligence. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp and predatory to belong to any normal animal. As it completed its turn, the creature began to walk away from the house. Its gait was smooth and purposeful, covering ground quickly with long strides. I watched in stunned silence as it moved across our back lawn, heading towards the small apple orchard at the edge of our property. Just before it reached the tree line, it paused. For one heart-stopping moment, it turned its head and looked back towards the house. I swear those eyes locked right onto me, pinning me in place with a gaze that seemed to look right through me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the orchard. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I became aware that I was shaking uncontrollably, my pajamas soaked with cold sweat. I managed to stumble back upstairs and crawl into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a frightened toddler. When my mum came to wake me for breakfast a few hours later, I was still huddled there, wide awake and trembling. I tried to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly explain something so impossible, so terrifying? I spent the rest of that day in a daze, jumping at every little sound and refusing to go anywhere near the back of the house. My parents were confused and concerned, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they would, and it would shatter the safety of our home forever. That night, I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any sound of the creature returning. Every shadow, every rustle of wind through the trees sent fresh waves of panic through me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but there was no making sense of it. What I'd witnessed simply shouldn't exist. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I refused to play outside anymore, especially anywhere near the orchard. My parents tried everything to figure out what was wrong with me, even took me to a child psychologist. But I kept the truth bottled up inside, too terrified to speak it aloud. As the weeks passed, the raw terror began to fade somewhat, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. I found myself obsessively researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena, desperate for some explanation of what I'd seen. I pored over every Bigfoot sighting, every local legend about strange creatures in the woods. But nothing quite matched what I'd encountered that morning. The experience changed me in ways that have lasted a lifetime. To this day, I can't stand being outside after dark. The thought of camping or hiking in remote areas fills me with a primal dread that I can't shake. I've never been able to look at the woods the same way again, always half expecting to see that massive fur-covered form emerge from between the trees. I know how it sounds. Believe me, there's a part of me that spent decades trying to convince myself it was all just a particularly vivid nightmare or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The memory is too vivid, too visceral to be anything but truth. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever seen it. In all my research over the years, I've never found any other sightings that quite match what I witnessed. Was I the only one to ever encounter this creature? Or are there others out there, keeping their own terrifying secrets? I've thought about going back to Lake Okanagan, facing my fears and maybe finding some answers, but every time I seriously consider it, that old paralyzing terror comes rushing back. What if it's still out there? What if seeing me again triggers some kind of response? I don't think I could handle another encounter, so I stay away, and I keep my story to myself. Until now, I guess. I'm not sure why I'm finally sharing this after all these years. Maybe it's the need for some kind of closure, or the hope that someone out there might have answers. Or maybe I just need to know I'm not alone in carrying this burden. All I know for certain is that what I saw that summer morning was real. It was huge, it was terrifying, and it changed my life forever. And somewhere out there, in the forests around Lake Okanagan, it might still be waiting, watching, remembering. Story 13. We set out early that morning, our skis gliding smoothly over the powdery snow. The forest was silent, except for the soft swish of our movements. As we made our way along the lakeshore, I noticed something odd in the snow ahead of us. At first I thought it was just some animal tracks, but as we got closer, I realized these were no ordinary prints. The tracks were enormous, easily twice the size of a human footprint. My heart started racing as I examined them more closely. They were clearly bipedal prints, with 5 distinct toes, but far larger than any human or known animal in the area could make. Jenna and I exchanged worried glances. What on earth could have made these? Curiosity got the better of our apprehension, and we decided to follow the tracks to see where they led. We skied along the trail of massive footprints, which seemed to meander aimlessly through the trees. After about 15 minutes, we came upon a small clearing and stopped dead in our tracks. There, in the middle of the clearing, were several large impressions in the snow, almost like snow angels, but on a much grander scale. It was as if something huge had laid down and rolled around in the snow. The outlines were vaguely humanoid in shape, but again, far too large to have been made by a person. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I surveyed the scene. Whatever had made these wasn't just big, it was massive, and there was more than one of them based on the multiple impressions. Jenna clutched my arm tightly, her face pale. "We should go," she whispered urgently. I nodded in agreement, suddenly very aware of how exposed and vulnerable we were. We turned to head back the way we came, moving as quickly and quietly as we could on our skis. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made us jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some hulking form emerge from the trees. But we made it back to our car without incident, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. On the drive home, Jenna and I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. But who would go to such lengths in such a remote area? And those footprints were so perfectly formed, it seemed impossible they could have been faked. We eventually agreed not to tell anyone about our experience, fearing we'd be labeled as crazy. But the memory of those massive tracks and snow impressions haunted me for years. Fast forward to the summer of 1994. My daughter Amy, who was 12 at the time, had been begging me to take her boating on Lake Swap. I was hesitant at first, given my experience there 20 years earlier, but I told myself I was being irrational. Nothing had happened since then, and it was probably just a one-off strange occurrence. So I agreed to take her out for a day on the lake. It was a beautiful sunny day as we cruised along in our small motorboat. Amy was having a blast, trailing her hand in the cool water and pointing out interesting things along the shoreline. As we rounded a small cove, she suddenly went quiet. I looked over at her and saw her staring intently at something on the shore, her eyes wide. "Dad," she said in a hushed voice, "What's that behind that bush?" I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, partially obscured by a large rhododendron bush, was a massive, dark figure. It was crouched down, but even hunched over it was clearly much larger than a human. The creature was covered in thick, shaggy hair and had a distinctly ape-like appearance. But this was no ordinary ape. Its proportions were all wrong, far too large and oddly human-like in its posture. For a brief moment, it turned its head and seemed to look right at us. I caught a glimpse of a flat, hairless face with deep-set eyes. Then, in a flash of movement almost too quick to follow, it stood up to its full height, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, and loped off into the dense forest. Amy let out a frightened squeak, and I snapped out of my shocked daze. I gunned the motor and sped us out of there as fast as the little boat could go. Amy was shaking and kept asking what we had seen. I tried to calm her down, saying it was probably just a bear, but we both knew that wasn't true. As we raced back across the lake, memories of that winter day 20 years ago came flooding back. The massive footprints in the snow, those strange snow angel impressions. It all made a horrible kind of sense now. Whatever we had encountered back then, I was now certain it wasn't human. When we got home, I sat Amy down and finally told her about my experience all those years ago. She listened with rapt attention, her eyes getting bigger and bigger. When I finished, she said, "Dad, I think we saw Bigfoot." I wanted to dismiss the idea, to come up with some rational explanation, but deep down, I knew she was probably right. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and encounters. I've read countless reports from all over North America describing creatures eerily similar to what Amy and I saw that day. Many of them mention the same details: the massive size, the quick, fluid movements, the human-like posture. It's hard to believe all these people could be making up such similar stories. I've never gone back to Lake Shuswap. The memories are still too vivid, too unsettling, but I often find myself wondering about those creatures. Are they still out there, roaming the wilderness? How have they managed to stay hidden for so long? And most chillingly, what would happen if one decided to make itself known to the wider world? I don't have any answers, only more questions. But I know what I saw, both in 1974 and again 20 years later. Those experiences changed how I view the world and opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there we still don't understand. I can't prove what Amy and I encountered was Bigfoot, but I also can't deny the evidence of my own eyes. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I find myself listening intently for any unusual sounds outside. A part of me is always on alert now, wondering if someday I'll hear heavy footsteps or catch a glimpse of a towering, hair-covered figure. The rational part of my brain says it's unlikely, but after what I've seen, I can never be 100% sure. So I keep watching and listening and wondering, because once you've had an encounter like mine, you can never look at the world quite the same way again. There are things out there in the wilderness, ancient, mysterious things that defy explanation, and sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 14. It all started with our dog, Rex. He was usually pretty calm, but for days he'd been barking non-stop, especially at night. We couldn't figure out what was bothering him. I'd go outside, shine my flashlight around, but never saw anything. We just assumed it was some wildlife passing through. Then one night, Rex just disappeared. We called for him, searched the woods, but he was gone without a trace. It was unsettling, to say the least. My wife was pretty shaken up about it, and honestly, so was I. The forest suddenly felt a lot less welcoming. A few nights after Rex vanished, things took a turn for the truly bizarre. It was around midnight, and my wife needed to use the outhouse. Yeah, we were pretty rustic back then. No indoor plumbing. I was half asleep when she left, but I remember her saying she'd be right back. What felt like only moments later, I heard the cabin door slam open. My wife came running in, white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. I jumped out of bed, asking her what was wrong. She could barely speak, just kept saying, "There's something out there," over and over. When I finally got her to calm down enough to explain, what she told me chilled me to the bone. She said that as she was leaving the outhouse, she came face to face with something. She couldn't describe it clearly, just that it was big, much bigger than a person. And the smell, she said it was the most awful stench she'd ever encountered, like rotting meat and wet fur. The thing that really got to me was when she said it was so close she could have reached out and touched it. The thought of my wife being that near to some unknown creature in the dark, it made my blood run cold. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and headed outside, determined to figure out what had scared her so badly. The night was eerily quiet as I stepped off the porch. The beam of my flashlight seemed feeble against the wall of darkness surrounding our cabin. As I moved towards the outhouse, I started hearing something. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, more like heavy footsteps. But they weren't the four-legged gait of a bear or a wolf. No, these were distinctly bipedal. Something was walking on two legs out there in the dark. I called out, thinking maybe it was a person, though I couldn't imagine who'd be wandering around our property at this hour. No response, just those heavy footsteps moving away from me now. Then I heard something else. It's hard to describe, kind of like a low, guttural cry. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd never heard anything like it before, and I haven't since. I'll admit it. I was scared. Part of me wanted to run back to the cabin and lock the door, but I kept thinking about Rex, about whatever had terrified my wife. I had to know what was out there. I followed the sound, moving deeper into the woods. The footsteps were getting fainter, but that smell my wife described, I caught whiffs of it. She was right. It was horrific, like something had died and been left to rot in the summer heat. Suddenly, my flashlight beam caught something. For just a second, I saw a massive shape moving between the trees. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark fur. Before I could get a better look, it was gone, melting into the shadows with surprising speed for something so large. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding. Part of me still couldn't believe what I'd seen. I wanted to follow, to get proof of whatever this thing was. But a deeper instinct told me that would be a very, very bad idea. So I turned and hurried back to the cabin as fast as I could without actually running. My wife was waiting for me, still visibly shaken. I told her what I'd seen and heard. We stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound from outside. When dawn finally came, we were exhausted but too wired to sleep. We spent that day debating what to do. My wife wanted to leave, to go stay with her parents in town. I was torn. Part of me wanted to stay and figure out what was going on, but I couldn't deny how frightened we both were. In the end, we decided to call my father-in-law. He lived in a trailer just on the outskirts of Hazelton, and we thought maybe he could come out and stay with us for a few days. Safety in numbers, you know. When I got him on the phone, though, he sounded off, distracted, almost panicky. When I asked what was wrong, what he told me made my blood run cold all over again. He said that something was outside his trailer. He'd woken up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and found that he couldn't open his door. Something was pressing against it, holding it shut. He'd heard heavy breathing on the other side, and that same awful smell was seeping in through the cracks. I told him to stay put, that we were coming to get him right away. We threw some clothes in a bag and jumped in the truck. The whole drive into town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive loping after us. When we got to my father-in-law's place, he was a wreck. He hadn't slept, hadn't moved from where he was sitting with his back braced against the door. We got him into the truck and headed straight for my wife's sister's place in Prince George. We spent a week there, trying to make sense of what had happened. We called the local authorities, but they didn't take us seriously. Said it was probably just a bear, even though we insisted that what we'd seen and heard wasn't like any bear we'd ever encountered. Eventually, we had to go back. We had jobs, responsibilities, but things were never the same. We were always on edge, always watching the tree line. We'd hear strange noises at night sometimes, or catch that horrific smell on the wind. But we never saw the creature clearly again. We moved away the following year. Couldn't take the stress anymore. To this day, I don't know what it was we encountered out there in the woods near Hazelton. Bigfoot, some unknown species? I can't say for sure. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and it changed our lives forever. Sometimes I think about Rex, wonder what happened to him, and I wonder if that thing is still out there, roaming the forests of British Columbia. I hope I never find out for sure. Story 15. The morning started out perfect. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, and the fresh scent of pine in the air as we set out on the trail. The boys were in high spirits, chattering excitedly as we hiked through the dense forest. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this job, surrounded by such natural beauty. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I first noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees to our right. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a deer or some other animal. But then it happened again, about 20 minutes later. This time, Mark saw it too. We exchanged a look of concern, but didn't want to alarm the boys. As we continued hiking, both Mark and I were on high alert, scanning the forest around us. That's when we saw it clearly for the first time. About 50 yards ahead of us, through a gap in the trees, was an enormous black figure. It had to be at least 8 or 9 meters tall. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too large to be human. Before I could get a better look, it moved with surprising speed behind a large tree and disappeared. I grabbed Mark's arm, my hand shaking. Did you see that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" he muttered. We quickly got the boys' attention, telling them we needed to take a break. As they sat down for a snack, Mark and I stepped away to discuss what we'd seen. Neither of us could explain it. We debated turning back, but we were already halfway to our campsite for the night. We decided to proceed cautiously, keeping a close eye out for any further sightings. As we hiked on, the carefree mood from earlier was gone. Mark and I were tense, constantly scanning our surroundings. The boys picked up on our unease, becoming quieter and sticking closer together. We saw the figure twice more that afternoon, always at a distance, always disappearing quickly into the trees. Each time, it sent chills down my spine. I'd never believed in creatures like Bigfoot, but I was struggling to rationalize what we were seeing. Adding to our unease were other strange signs we began noticing along the trail. We came across several areas where large branches had been snapped off trees, far higher than any person could reach, and the footprints, massive, human-like prints in the soft dirt, easily twice the size of my own foot. By the time we reached our campsite in the early evening, I was a nervous wreck. Every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump. Mark wasn't faring much better. We tried to act normal for the boys' sake, but I could tell they sensed something was wrong. As darkness fell, we got a fire going, and the boys settled into their sleeping bags. Mark and I agreed to take turns keeping watch through the night. I took the first shift, sitting by the fire and straining my eyes to peer into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. Around midnight, I heard it, a deep, guttural roar echoing through the mountains. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, sending icy fingers of fear down my spine. The sound seemed to go on forever, reverberating through the trees. Several of the boys woke up, frightened by the noise. Mark and I did our best to calm them, saying it was probably just a bear or mountain lion in the distance. But we exchanged knowing glances. Whatever had made that sound was no ordinary animal. The roars continued intermittently through the night. None of us got much sleep. We kept the fire burning bright, huddling close to it for safety. I've never felt so small and vulnerable as I did that night, feeling like we were being watched by something massive and unknown in the darkness. As dawn finally broke, we quickly packed up camp. The boys were eager to get moving, clearly unsettled by the night's events. As we hiked back, the forest seemed different, oppressive and menacing where it had been welcoming just yesterday. We saw the figure one last time as we neared the end of the trail. It was standing partially hidden behind a large tree about 100 yards away, watching us. Even at that distance, I could make out its massive frame, covered in dark fur. For a brief moment our eyes seemed to meet, and I felt a jolt of primal fear course through me. Then it turned and loped away into the forest, surprisingly graceful for its size. When we finally got back to the main camp, Mark and I had a long discussion about what to do. We were both shaken to our core by what we'd experienced, but we also knew how crazy it would sound if we tried to tell anyone. In the end, we agreed to keep it to ourselves, not wanting to cause a panic at the camp or risk our jobs by sounding like lunatics. To this day, I've never told anyone else the full story of what happened on that hike. I've run it over in my mind countless times, trying to find some rational explanation. But I know what I saw. Something huge and unknown was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. I never went back to that particular hiking trail again. In fact, I left my job at the camp at the end of that summer, unable to shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was in the forest. The experience changed me profoundly. I no longer feel at ease in the wilderness, always wondering what might be lurking just out of sight. I still struggle to make sense of it all. Was it some unknown species, a creature out of legend, or something else entirely? I don't have any answers, only the vivid memories of that terrifying day and night in the forest. Whatever it was, I hope I never encounter it again. Some mysteries I've learned are better left unsolved. Story 16. The day started like any other. I woke up early, had my usual breakfast of toast and coffee, and got Max ready for our hike. He was always excited for our adventures, wagging his tail and running circles around me as I packed our gear. We'd been on countless hikes together, but this one would be different. As we drove to our usual spot, I noticed the weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not too cold, with a light dusting of fresh snow on the ground. Perfect conditions for spotting wildlife tracks, I thought to myself. Little did I know just how strange the tracks we'd find would be. We started our hike on a familiar trail, Max bounding ahead as always. About an hour in, we veered off onto a less traveled path that I wanted to explore. The forest was quiet, with just the crunch of snow under our feet and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. That's when I saw them, the tracks. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I got closer, my heart started racing. These weren't just any tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my size 40 boots. And there were two sets, one larger and one slightly smaller, walking side by side. I've seen all kinds of animal tracks in my years of hiking, but nothing like this. They were clearly bipedal with a human-like shape, but the size, it was unreal. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Max's behavior snapped me out of my trance. He was acting strange, sniffing the tracks intently and whining softly. This wasn't like him at all. Usually he'd be excited by animal scents, barking and wagging his tail. But this was different. He seemed afraid. I decided to follow the tracks, my curiosity overcoming my growing sense of unease. Max stayed close to my side, which was unusual for him. We walked for what felt like hours, the massive footprints leading us deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. As we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort for me, suddenly felt alien and threatening. The tracks led us to a small clearing. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a cougar or any animal I was familiar with. It was something else. Max started growling, his hackles raised. I'd never seen him like this before. He was always a brave dog, but now he was trembling, pressing against my leg like he wanted to run, but was too scared to move. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it, just for a split second. A massive, dark figure moving between the trees. It was too big to be a person, too upright to be a bear. In that moment, all the stories I'd heard about Bigfoot came flooding back to me. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I grabbed Max's collar and we ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. The sound of heavy footsteps behind us only made us run faster. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting back to the safety of my car. We finally burst out onto the main trail, and the footsteps behind us stopped. I didn't look back, just kept running until we reached the parking lot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As we drove home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the tracks were some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure moving through the trees. I kept hearing that unnatural sound echoing in my head. Max wouldn't leave my side, whimpering softly whenever I tried to go to another room. The next day, I knew I had to go back. I needed proof, needed to know I wasn't going crazy. I grabbed my camera and headed out at first light, leaving Max at home this time. He refused to get in the car, something he'd never done before. But when I got to the trailhead, my heart sank. It had rained overnight, and most of the snow had melted. I spent hours searching for those tracks, retracing our steps from the day before, but it was useless. The forest had erased all evidence of our encounter. I've never told anyone about what happened that day. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I heard. And I know that somewhere out there, in the forests of British Columbia, there's something that defies explanation. Since that day, I've never hiked that trail again. Max refused to go on hikes for months afterward, and even now, years later, he gets anxious when we're in the woods. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can hear that sound again, carried on the wind from the distant mountains. I don't know what we encountered that day, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely. But I do know that it changed me forever. The forests I once found so comforting now hold a sense of mystery and danger that I can't shake. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find similar encounters, looking for any shred of evidence that might validate my experience. But in the end, all I have are my memories and the lingering fear that someday, somehow, I might come face to face with that creature again. Sometimes, I wonder if it's still out there, leaving those massive tracks in the snow, watching hikers from the shadows of the trees. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing from the mountains, I swear I can hear that low, guttural sound echoing in the distance, a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we can't explain. Story 17. That particular night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Tommy was fast asleep next to me, snoring softly. I unzipped the tent flap to peek outside, thinking maybe I'd heard a raccoon or something. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, near the edge of our property where the woods began, was a massive, dark figure. At first, my sleepy brain thought it was a bear, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something I'd never seen before. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet high, and it was covered in thick, dark fur that looked almost black in the dim moonlight. But what really struck me was how it moved. It wasn't lumbering like a bear. It walked upright, smoothly and quickly, with long strides. I froze, afraid to move or make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to wake Tommy, but I was paralyzed with fear. The creature paused near a large oak tree at the edge of our yard. That's when it turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes for as long as I live. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, almost human-like. But there was an intensity to them that sent chills down my spine. It didn't seem afraid of me at all. It just stared, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. I noticed its arms were long and muscular, covered in the same dark fur as the rest of its body. Its hands looked almost human, but larger, with long fingers. Then, in a blink, it was gone. It moved so fast I could hardly believe it. 1 second it was there, the next it had vanished into the tree line. I sat there frozen for what must have been at least an hour, too terrified to move or make a sound. When the sun finally started to rise, I shook Tommy awake and insisted we go inside. I was too scared to tell him or my parents what I'd seen. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they'd think I was making it up for attention. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intense, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I begged my parents to let me sleep inside, making up excuses about mosquitoes or being too cold. I spent countless hours researching, trying to find an explanation for what I'd seen. That's when I first learned about Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. The descriptions matched what I'd witnessed: the height, the fur, the way it moved. But nothing I read could capture the intelligence and intensity I'd seen in those eyes. As the years went by, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, or my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I've never been able to shake the feeling that for those few moments, I'd made contact with something beyond our understanding. I'm 50 now, and I've never told anyone this story before. I'm still not sure why it chose to reveal itself to me that night. Was it curiosity, a warning, or just a random encounter? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that night changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we realize, that there are creatures out there, intelligent beings, that we've yet to fully understand or acknowledge. I've been back to that spot many times over the years, hoping for another glimpse, but I've never seen it again. Sometimes, though, when I'm in the woods, I get the feeling I'm being watched, and for a split second, I'll catch a whiff of a musky, animal-like scent that takes me right back to that summer night in 1984. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Honestly, if someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw, and I know those eyes will stay with me for the rest of my life. To this day, I can't explain why it appeared that night and never again. Was it passing through? Was it checking on us? Or was it just a once-in-a-lifetime encounter that I happened to be awake for? These questions have haunted me for decades. I've often wondered if it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Did it tell others of its kind about the small human child it encountered that night? Does it remember me as vividly as I remember it? The encounter has affected every aspect of my life. I became an avid hiker and camper, spending as much time in the woods as possible, always hoping for another glimpse. I studied biology in college, focusing on primatology, driven by a desire to understand what I'd seen. But despite all my research and time spent outdoors, I've never had another experience like that night. I've heard stories from others, hikers who've found strange footprints, campers who've heard unexplained noises in the night, but nothing that comes close to my face-to-face encounter. Sometimes late at night, I find myself staring out into the darkness, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure again. Part of me hopes I will, while another part is terrified at the thought. I've debated for years whether to share this story. I'm sure some will think I'm crazy or attention-seeking, but I know what I saw. And I feel like I owe it to others to share my experience, to let them know that there are things out there beyond our understanding. To this day, I can't look at the woods the same way. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every rustle of leaves could be footsteps. It's both thrilling and terrifying. I often wonder about the creature's life. Does it have a family, a community? How long has its kind been living alongside us, undetected? Are they ancient, or a more recent evolutionary branch? The questions are endless, and I know I'll probably never get answers. But that's okay. Sometimes the mystery is more important than the solution. It keeps us humble, reminds us that we don't know everything about our world. So if you're ever camping in the Fraser Valley, or really anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see in the shadows, and if you do see something, don't be afraid. Remember, it's probably just as curious about you as you are about it. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep hoping for another encounter. Because once you've looked into the eyes of something that science says doesn't exist, you never see the world quite the same way again. Story 18. I was driving along the Trans-Canada Highway near Revelstoke, British Columbia, on a quiet summer evening in July 1985. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I had been on the road for hours, making my way back home after visiting family out east. The monotony of the drive had lulled me into a sort of trance-like state, my mind wandering as the trees blurred past. Suddenly, something caught my eye up ahead that snapped me to full alertness. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was seeing. There was a massive, dark figure emerging from the tree line on the right side of the highway, about 300-400 feet ahead of me. As I got closer, I realized with a jolt of shock that it was some kind of enormous creature. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing. The creature was absolutely massive, easily 9 feet tall, with an incredibly broad, muscular build. It had to weigh at least 700-900 pounds. The proportions were all wrong for a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen. As I watched in stunned disbelief, the creature paused at the edge of the road. To my amazement, it actually seemed to look both ways, as if checking for traffic. There was an eerie intelligence to its movements. It turned its head slowly, scanning the highway in both directions. I could make out the massive barrel chest and impossibly wide shoulders. The arms were long and powerfully built, swinging slightly as it moved. My brain was desperately trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but coming up empty. This was no bear, no known animal. The way it moved on 2 legs, the human-like qualities to its behavior. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. After apparently determining the coast was clear, the creature began to cross the road with long, purposeful strides. Its gait was smooth but slightly lumbering, as if its massive bulk made graceful movement difficult. I was close enough now to make out more details. The creature was covered in dark, shaggy hair. The head seemed somewhat cone-shaped, sitting directly on those epic shoulders with little discernible neck. As it reached the center of the highway, the creature suddenly stopped and turned its head in my direction. I felt a chill run down my spine as I locked eyes with it. The face was not quite human, not quite ape, something in between that defied explanation. The eyes seemed to glow slightly in the fading light, reflecting like an animal's. For a split second, we stared at each other across the distance. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of primal fear wash over me. Every instinct in my body was screaming danger. This was an apex predator, something that could tear me apart without breaking a sweat. I had the sense that I was in the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that did not belong in this world. The eye contact lasted only a second or two, but it felt like an eternity. Then the spell was broken as the creature turned away and continued across the road. Its long strides ate up the remaining distance quickly. Within moments, it had disappeared into the dense forest on the other side of the highway. I sat there in my idling car, hands shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to pull over, to go investigate or try to find some trace of the creature. But the rational part of my brain knew that would be incredibly foolish and dangerous. Whatever that thing was, I had no desire to encounter it up close. After a few minutes, I finally got my nerves under control enough to continue driving. I spent the rest of the trip in a daze, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some explanation for what I'd seen. But I knew deep down that I had witnessed something outside the realm of conventional zoology. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled with whether or not to report my sighting. Who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos or physical evidence, just the vivid memory of those few surreal moments on the highway. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. But the experience has haunted me ever since. To this day, I can't drive that stretch of highway without tensing up, half expecting to see that hulking figure emerge from the trees again. I've researched similar sightings in the area, read up on cryptozoology and Bigfoot theories, but nothing quite matches what I saw that evening. I know what I witnessed was real. The sheer size and power of the creature, the intelligence in its movements, and that chilling moment of eye contact. It's all seared into my memory. Sometimes I wish I could forget, go back to seeing the world as I did before. But that brief encounter changed everything. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our current understanding. I often wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming the vast wilderness of British Columbia. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse someday, to validate what I experienced, but a bigger part hopes I never encounter anything like it again. The memory alone is enough to send shivers down my spine, even all these years later. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, there are times I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that summer evening in 1985. And I'll never forget the mixture of awe and terror I felt as I watched that impossible creature cross the Trans-Canada Highway and vanish into the forest, leaving me to question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The encounter lasted only a minute or two, but it fundamentally altered my perception of reality. I find myself constantly scanning the tree line when I'm in wooded areas now, half expecting and half dreading to catch another glimpse of something unexplainable. I've become hyper-aware of strange sounds in the forest, of shadows moving in the periphery of my vision. In the years since, I've done extensive research into Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters. I've read countless reports and eyewitness accounts, but nothing quite matches up with what I saw that day. The sheer size and bulk of the creature I encountered dwarfs most other descriptions, and that eerie, almost human-like behavior of checking for traffic, I've never come across another report that mentions anything similar. I've toyed with the idea of reaching out to Bigfoot researchers or cryptozoologists over the years, but something always holds me back. Maybe it's the fear of ridicule, or the worry that reliving the experience in such detail would be too traumatic. Or perhaps deep down, I want to keep the encounter as my own private revelation, a glimpse behind the curtain of reality that was meant for my eyes alone. There are nights when I lie awake, reliving those moments on the highway in vivid detail. The way the fading sunlight glinted off the creature's eyes, the ripple of muscle beneath its shaggy coat as it moved, the utter alienness of its face, familiar yet so deeply wrong. In my dreams, the encounter often plays out differently. Sometimes the creature charges my car, its massive fists shattering the windshield. Other times, I find myself paralyzed as it slowly approaches, those glowing eyes boring into my soul. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of escaped gorilla or other large primate. Perhaps it was an elaborate hoax, someone in an incredibly realistic costume. But deep down, I know those explanations don't hold water. What I saw that day was something unknown to science, something that shouldn't exist in our modern world. The encounter has left me with a profound sense of humility about humanity's place in the natural order. If a creature like that can exist, undiscovered, in the wilds of North America, what else might be out there? What other mysteries and impossibilities are hiding just beyond the veil of our understanding? I often find myself drawn back to that stretch of highway, though I've never worked up the courage to stop and explore the surrounding wilderness. Part of me longs for another sighting, for validation of what I experienced, but a larger part dreads the possibility of coming face to face with that creature again. The memory of that primal fear, that sense of being utterly outmatched by an apex predator, is not something I'm eager to relive. So I carry this secret knowledge with me, this burden of an impossible truth. I see the world differently now, always aware that there are things out there beyond our comprehension. That brief encounter on a summer evening in 1985 shattered my understanding of reality. And while part of me wishes I could go back to blissful ignorance, I know that's impossible. Once you've glimpsed behind the curtain, there's no unknowing what you've seen. All I can do now is remain vigilant, always watching the tree line, always listening for heavy footsteps in the underbrush, and hope that if I ever do encounter that creature again, it shows the same disinterest in me that it did on that fateful day on the Trans-Canada Highway. Story 19. The morning of June 15th started out like any other day on the trail. We woke up early, packed our gear, and hit the path as the sun was rising. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees. Birds were chirping all around us as we made our way higher into the mountains. We'd been hiking for a few hours when things started to feel off. I can't really explain it, but there was this growing sense of unease. The forest had gotten quieter, like all the animals had suddenly gone silent. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I glanced at Mike and could tell he felt it too. That's when we heard it, a deep, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was like a cross between a roar and a scream, echoing through the trees. We froze in our tracks, hearts pounding. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered. I just shook my head, eyes wide as I scanned the forest around us. We debated turning back, but decided to press on cautiously. Part of me was curious, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. As we rounded a bend in the trail, that's when we saw it. About 50 yards ahead of us on the path was this massive jet-black thing. I say thing because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but impossibly huge. I'd estimate 9 or 10 feet tall at least, and the proportions were all wrong, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. For a split second, it just stood there motionless. Then its head slowly turned toward us. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark and intelligent, studying us with an almost human-like awareness. A chill ran down my spine. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. One moment it was there, the next it had vanished into the thick forest. Mike and I stood there in shocked silence for what felt like an eternity. Did you see that? I finally managed to stammer out. Mike just nodded, his face pale. We cautiously approached the spot where it had been standing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there in the mud were the clearest footprints I've ever seen. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, and had this weird, almost human-like shape to them. 5 toes, but much wider and flatter than a normal foot. As we examined the prints, a foul odor hit us. It was this musky, animalistic smell, kind of like wet dog, but stronger and more pungent. My stomach turned as another wave of that scent washed over us. "We should get out of here," Mike said urgently. I couldn't have agreed more. But as we turned to leave, something caught my eye off to the side of the trail. There was this clearing, maybe 15 feet across, where the underbrush had been flattened down. Curious, we went over to check it out. What we found made my blood run cold. It was some kind of nest or bed, made entirely of huckleberry leaves and branches. They had been woven together in an intricate pattern that was clearly intentional. This wasn't just some random pile of vegetation. It showed intelligence and dexterity. "No way a bear or any other animal could make this," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Mike nodded in agreement. "And no human would sleep out here like this either," he added. We knew we needed to get far away from there, and fast. As we hurried back to the main trail, I happened to glance up at the trees surrounding us. That's when I saw it. About 8 feet up, one of the trunks was a broken branch. The bark had been stripped away, revealing bare wood underneath. Whatever that creature was, it was tall enough to bump its head on branches that high up. The reality of its sheer size hit me all over again. We practically ran down that mountain, not stopping until we reached our campsite. Neither of us slept a wink that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on edge, imagining that thing was out there watching us. The next morning, we packed up and got the hell out of there. We debated reporting what we saw to the ranger station, but who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. So we kept it to ourselves, trying our best to rationalize what had happened. But to this day, I can't explain what we encountered up on that mountain. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. I've never gone back to those mountains. The memory of those intelligent eyes staring at me, that massive dark shape, the intricate nest of leaves, it still haunts my dreams sometimes. I don't know what's out there in the wilderness, but I know there are things beyond our understanding. And I, for one, am content to leave them be. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I swear I can still smell that musky odor. And for a split second, I'm right back there on that mountain trail, face to face with the unexplainable. Those are the nights I don't sleep, instead lying awake and wondering, what if it found me? What if, someday, it comes looking? I've never told anyone this story before. Even now, years later, my hands are shaking as I type this out. Part of me hopes someone out there has had a similar experience, just so I know I'm not crazy. But another part hopes this was a one-time thing, a fluke encounter with something that should remain hidden in the depths of the forest. All I know for certain is that there are things in this world that defy explanation. And sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Story 20. That evening, Jake and I were hanging out on the back porch of the cabin, enjoying the cool night air after a hot summer day. His parents had gone into town for supplies, so we had the place to ourselves. We were just goofing around, talking about girls and our plans for the upcoming school year. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I remember feeling a sudden uneasiness. The forest behind the cabin seemed darker and more menacing than usual. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then Jake stopped mid-sentence, a look of confusion on his face. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I listened intently, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear were the usual nighttime forest sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a low moan, almost human-like, but quickly transformed into something else entirely. The sound grew in volume and intensity until it became a bone-chilling shriek, part human scream, part animal roar. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake and I looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we bolted for the cabin door. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. We slammed the door shut behind us, fumbling with shaking hands to lock it. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. Jake shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. I've never heard anything like it before." We huddled in the living room, peering nervously out the windows into the gathering darkness. The woods seemed alive with malevolent energy. Shadows danced between the trees, and every rustle of leaves made us jump. That's when we heard it again, that terrible, inhuman scream. It sounded closer this time, like whatever made it was approaching the cabin. I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide. Jake ran to his parents' room and came back with his dad's shotgun. His hands were shaking so badly I was afraid he might accidentally fire it. We huddled together in the center of the room, as far from the windows as possible. The minutes crawled by like hours. We heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by deep, guttural growls. Something large brushed against the side of the building, making the whole structure shudder. At one point, Jake worked up the courage to step out onto the porch, shotgun at the ready. I begged him not to go, but he insisted we needed to try to scare off whatever was out there. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound of the blast echoing through the forest. For a moment, everything went silent. Then we heard crashing sounds in the underbrush, like something large was moving away at high speed. Jake quickly retreated back inside, and we triple-checked that all the doors and windows were securely locked. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every sound. Sleep was impossible. I've never felt so vulnerable and exposed, even inside the cabin. It felt like the walls could barely keep out the malevolent presence lurking in the darkness outside. As dawn finally broke, the oppressive feeling of dread began to lift. We cautiously ventured outside, searching for signs of what had terrorized us all night. The underbrush at the forest's edge was trampled and broken in places, and we found a few strange, large footprints in the soft earth. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, massive and oddly shaped, definitely not from any normal animal. Jake's parents returned later that morning, and we told them what had happened. His dad seemed skeptical at first, but the footprints and destruction around the property were undeniable evidence that something had been there. We spent the rest of the trip on edge, hardly daring to go outside after dark. I've never been so relieved to return home at the end of a vacation. For months afterwards, I had terrible nightmares about that night. Even now, the sound of that inhuman scream sometimes echoes in my mind, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I've replayed the events of that night in my head countless times over the years, trying to make sense of what happened. Was it some kind of unknown animal, a Bigfoot or other cryptid, or something even more sinister and unexplainable? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but the terror of that night in the woods of British Columbia will stay with me forever. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. Whatever was out there in those woods that night, it wasn't natural. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I worry that it's still out there somewhere, waiting. Story 21. It was around 11 p.m. when we decided to head out to Cameron Lake. There was an old gravel pit out there that was a popular spot for local kids to hang out and party. We figured we might run into some other people, maybe have a few beers. Little did we know our lives were about to change forever. As we drove down the dark, winding road towards the lake, an eerie feeling started to creep over me. The trees seemed to press in on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the glow of our headlights. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, sending a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We pulled into the gravel pit, tires crunching over loose stones. It was deserted, no other cars or people around. Jake cut the engine, and we sat there for a moment, the sudden silence pressing in on us. "Man, there's nobody here," Mike said from the back seat. "Maybe we should head somewhere else." I was about to agree when movement at the edge of the headlights caught my eye. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly, and my blood ran cold. Standing there just at the edge of the light was something, some kind of creature. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and it was covered head to toe in dark, shaggy hair or fur, except for its face. Its face was bare, almost human-like, but wrong somehow, distorted, alien. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed an eerie orange color in the beam of the headlights, like some kind of demonic cat's eyes. And they were staring right at us. For what felt like an eternity, we all just froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could barely even blink as I stared at this impossible thing before us. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, perfectly still, those glowing orange eyes locked onto our car. I don't know how long we sat there, paralyzed with fear. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. Finally, Jake managed to find his voice. "What the f—" he started to say. That seemed to break the spell. Mike started yelling from the back seat, "Go! Go! Get us out of here!" Jake fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad he could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel as we peeled out of there. I twisted around in my seat, heart pounding, to see if the thing was chasing us. But it was gone, vanished into the darkness as quickly and silently as it had appeared. We tore down that road like bats out of hell, not slowing down until we hit the main highway. We were all breathing hard, eyes wide with shock and disbelief at what we'd just seen. What the hell was that thing?" Mike finally asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I said. "But it wasn't human. It wasn't natural." "Maybe it was just some guy in a costume," Jake suggested weakly. But we all knew that wasn't true. No costume could explain those eyes, that otherworldly presence that radiated pure menace. We drove in tense silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke up again. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said firmly. "They'll think we're crazy, or on drugs or something." Mike and I nodded in agreement. Who would believe us anyway? But I knew I'd never forget what I saw that night. Those glowing orange eyes still haunt my dreams sometimes. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just shadows and our imaginations running wild. Maybe we'd all shared some kind of mass hallucination. We even went back to that gravel pit in the daytime, half expecting, hoping, to find some logical explanation. But there was nothing. No tracks. No sign that anything unusual had ever been there. Just an ordinary, abandoned gravel pit. We started hearing rumors, though. Whispered stories of other sightings in the area over the years. A logger who quit his job after seeing something in the woods. Hikers who came back from camping trips with wild tales of strange noises in the night. I found myself researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena, desperate for some answers. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The stories went back decades, centuries even. Indigenous legends of wild men in the forests. But nothing quite matched what we saw that night. As time passed, Jake and Mike seemed eager to forget about it, to write it off as some shared delusion brought on by teenage boredom and overactive imaginations. But I couldn't let it go. I started spending more time out in the woods, hoping for another glimpse. Rational thought told me I was being foolish, that I should be scared to go back out there alone. But some primal part of me needed to know, needed to understand. I never saw the creature again. But sometimes when I'm out hiking remote trails or camping in the backcountry, I'll get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And for just a moment, I'll catch a whiff of something musky and wild on the breeze, or hear the snap of a twig in the underbrush that sounds just a little too deliberate, and I'll wonder, is it out there still, lurking in the shadows of the deep forest, watching, waiting? For what, I don't know. I'm 54 years old now, married with kids of my own. I've got a good job, a nice house in the suburbs. To all outward appearances, I'm just another ordinary middle-aged guy living an ordinary life. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I'll find myself staring out the window into the tree line at the edge of our property. And for just a moment, I'll see a flicker of movement, a flash of orange in the darkness. And I'll wonder, was it real? Did it really happen? Or was it just the fevered imaginings of three bored teenagers looking for a thrill? I don't have any answers. I probably never will. But I know what I saw that night, what we all saw, and it changed me forever. So I guess I'm sharing this now as a warning. Be careful out there in the wild places. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist, but do. And sometimes they're watching us. Story 22. I'll never forget that day in 1987. I was just a kid, around 8 or 9 years old, living on our family farm in Langley, British Columbia. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I was out playing in the yard near our old red barn. The air had that distinct fall smell, a mix of dried leaves and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. I was running around, pretending to be an explorer in the wilderness, when I suddenly got the strangest feeling that I was being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. I froze mid-step and slowly turned towards the barn. That's when I saw it. Standing there, partially hidden behind the corner of the barn, was this creature. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was covered in thick, shaggy brown fur from head to toe. But the thing that really struck me was how it was standing. It wasn't upright like a person, but kind of hunched over and leaning forward. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was too shocked to move or make a sound. The creature's eyes were dark and intelligent-looking. It didn't seem aggressive or angry, just curious, like it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I don't know how long we stood there locked in that silent stare-down. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then I heard the screen door of our house slam shut, and our tenant, Mr. Johnson, came walking around the side of the house. As soon as Mr. Johnson appeared, the creature's head snapped in his direction. Mr. Johnson must have seen it too, because he let out this strangled yelp and stumbled backwards, nearly falling over. The creature didn't attack or run away, though. It just calmly turned and lumbered into the barn, disappearing into the shadows inside. The whole thing was so surreal. This massive, impossible creature just casually strolling into our barn like it belonged there. Mr. Johnson was freaking out, yelling something about Bigfoot and running back towards the house. But I just stood there, staring at the barn entrance where the creature had vanished. I don't know what came over me, but I started walking towards the barn. It was like I was in a trance. I had to know more. I had to see it again. But before I could get there, my mom came running out of the house. She must have heard Mr. Johnson's yelling. She grabbed me and dragged me inside, demanding to know what happened. Mr. Johnson was babbling about the creature, but my mom didn't believe him. She thought he was drunk or playing a prank. I tried to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. How could I describe something so impossible? I just kept saying, "big furry thing," over and over. My mom assumed I was just playing along with Mr. Johnson's joke and sent me to my room. For the rest of the day, I sat by my window, staring at the barn. I kept expecting to see the creature come out, but it never did. As the sun started to set, my dad and some of the farmhands went to check out the barn. They searched every inch of it but found nothing. No creature, no fur, no footprints. Nothing. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it really Bigfoot, like Mr. Johnson said? But Bigfoot was just a myth, right? Something made up to scare kids. This had been real. I had seen it with my own eyes. The next morning, my parents tried to convince me it had all been a dream or my imagination. Mr. Johnson had sobered up and was now claiming he hadn't seen anything either. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. For weeks after, I was obsessed. I spent every free moment searching the woods around our property, looking for any sign of the creature. I drew picture after picture of what I'd seen, trying to capture every detail. I even started reading every book I could find about Bigfoot and other cryptids. But as time passed, and I never saw the creature again, I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had been my imagination running wild. Maybe I had dozed off while playing and dreamed the whole thing. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college, that I stumbled across an online forum for people who had Bigfoot encounters. Reading through their stories, I was struck by how similar many of them were to my experience. The same sense of awe and disbelief, the same difficulty in fully describing what they'd seen, the same lingering doubt mixed with absolute certainty. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to really believe in what I'd seen that day. I posted my own story on the forum, and the response was overwhelming. So many people reached out to share similar experiences or to offer support and understanding. It's been over 30 years now since that day in Langley. I'm a grown man with kids of my own, but I've never forgotten that encounter. It fundamentally changed how I see the world and opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered before. I've been back to visit my old family farm a few times over the years. The barn is still there, though it's fallen into disrepair. Every time I see it, I get that same prickly feeling on the back of my neck. Part of me hopes to see the creature again, to finally get some answers. But another part of me is glad I haven't. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I don't know why it was there that day or where it went, but I know what I saw. And I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that blur the line between reality and myth. That day in 1987 may have only lasted a few moments, but it stayed with me for a lifetime. It taught me to question what I think I know, to keep an open mind, and to never dismiss something just because it seems impossible. Because sometimes the impossible is real. And sometimes it's standing right in front of you, watching you with curious eyes from behind an old red barn. Story 23. I was just a 19-year-old kid back in '92, working as a deckhand on my uncle's fishing boat up near Port Hardy. It was a crisp October morning when my buddy Jake and I decided to take advantage of our day off and go exploring along the coast. We'd heard stories about some of the weird stuff people claim to have seen in the forests around Vancouver Island, but honestly, we didn't give it much thought. We were just looking to kill some time and maybe find a good spot to crack open a few beers. We hiked a ways down the shoreline, scrambling over driftwood and rocks. It was chilly but sunny, one of those perfect fall days. After about an hour, we came to this little inlet with a sandy slope leading up to the tree line. Jake started picking up stones and skipping them across the water. I joined in, and we were just goofing around, seeing who could get the most skips. That's when I noticed something moving at the edge of the forest. At first I thought it was just shadows from the trees swaying, but then I realized the movement didn't match up with the breeze. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was definitely something there, something big. "Hey, Jake," I said, keeping my voice low. "You see that?" He followed my gaze and froze mid-throw. "What the hell is that?" As we watched, this creature emerged from behind a fallen log. I'll never forget the shock that went through me. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. This thing was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, more like shaggy hair all over its body. The hair was this light brownish color, but the weirdest part was its face. The forehead and around its eyes were a pale grayish white, and its face, God, its face. It had these deep-set eyes and a broad, flat nose. It looked almost human, but not quite. More like some kind of ape, but way bigger than any ape I'd ever seen. Jake and I just stood there, frozen. I don't think either of us was even breathing. The creature was standing partially behind the log, its massive hands resting on top. Those hands, they were enormous, easily twice the size of a man's. For a split second we just stared at each other. I swear those eyes locked right onto us. There was intelligence there, something almost knowing. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't some animal. This thing was aware. Then, faster than something that big should be able to move, it turned and bolted back into the forest. The whole encounter probably only lasted 10 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. Jake and I looked at each other, eyes wide. Did you see that?" I stammered. He nodded, face pale. "What the fuck was that thing?" We both started talking at once, our voices getting louder as the shock wore off and excitement took over. "Holy shit, dude! That had to be Bigfoot!" Jake yelled. "No way, man. Bigfoot's supposed to be all dark, right? This thing was light-colored," I argued back. We debated back and forth for a few minutes, still staring at the spot where we'd seen the creature. Part of me wanted to go investigate, to see if we could find tracks or hair or something, but a bigger part of me was terrified of getting any closer to those woods. In the end, we decided to head back to town. We practically ran the whole way, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes made us jump. When we got back, we went straight to the local bar. We needed a drink to calm our nerves. As soon as we walked in, people could tell something was up. We must have looked like we'd seen a ghost. Old Tom, the bartender, took one look at us and asked, "You boys all right? Look like you've had quite a fright." We spilled the whole story, talking over each other in our excitement. I expected people to laugh or tell us we were full of shit. But the bar got real quiet. A couple of the old-timers exchanged knowing looks. "Sounds like you boys had a run-in with old Whitehead," one of them said. "Old Whitehead?" I asked. The old guy nodded. "That's what the locals call it. Been sightings of that creature going back decades. Always described the same. Big, hairy, with that white patch on its head." Jake and I listened in amazement as several of the regulars shared their own stories or stories they'd heard. Apparently, sightings weren't common, but they happened often enough that a lot of people in the area believed something was out there. We spent the rest of the evening talking about what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. Part of me still couldn't believe it was real, but I knew what I'd seen. That creature, whatever it was, wasn't something that was supposed to exist. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, almost human eyes staring back at me. I kept imagining that thing out there in the dark, watching, waiting. The next day, Jake and I went back out to the spot where we'd seen it. We searched the area for hours, looking for tracks or hair or any sign that what we'd seen was real. But we didn't find anything conclusive. Just some broken branches and what might have been large footprints, but they were too distorted in the soft ground to be sure. In the days and weeks that followed, Jake and I told our story to anyone who would listen. Some people believed us. Others thought we were making it up or had just seen a bear. But we knew the truth. That encounter changed me. I've spent the last 30 years trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I've read every book I could find on Bigfoot and other cryptids. I've talked to other witnesses, gone on expeditions trying to find evidence, but I've never seen anything like that creature again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember those eyes, that moment of connection with something that shouldn't exist. And I know it was real. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day. There's something out there in those woods, something that defies explanation. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, I swear I can hear it calling. Story 24. I was out hunting bears that day in August '93, like I'd done countless times before. Fort St. James is prime bear country, and I knew those woods like the back of my hand. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. The day started normal enough. I'd driven out to my usual spot near the lake, where there was a big clearing from some recent logging. Perfect place to set up and wait for bears to wander through. I'd been sitting in my blind for a few hours, enjoying the quiet and keeping my eyes peeled. It was getting on towards evening when I first noticed something moving at the tree line across the clearing. At first I thought, finally a bear, but as I raised my binoculars, I realized this was no bear. The thing I saw through those lenses. I still get chills thinking about it. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. But it wasn't just the size that threw me. It was the way it moved. This creature was walking on 2 legs, with a gait that was unnervingly human-like, yet not quite right. Its arms were impossibly long, swinging at its sides as it walked. And its face, God, that face. It was flat and wide, with deep-set eyes that seemed to gleam with intelligence. I've been hunting bears for over 30 years. I know what a bear looks like, even standing up. This was no bear. This was something else entirely. What really got to me was how it moved across that clearing. It seemed to be walking casually, almost leisurely, but the ground it was covering. It was like some kind of optical illusion. In what felt like seconds, it had crossed half the clearing. I blinked, and it was at the other side. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place. All I could do was watch as this thing, this impossible creature, made its way along the tree line. It never looked in my direction, thank God. I don't know what I would have done if those eyes had locked onto me. As it was, I could barely breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. I don't know how long I sat there watching it. Time seemed to stretch and warp. But eventually, the creature disappeared into the trees on the far side of the clearing, and just like that, the spell was broken. I scrambled out of my blind, fumbling with my gear. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grab my rifle. I half ran, half stumbled back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. The drive home is a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white and checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. I kept expecting to see that thing loping after me, those long arms reaching for my truck. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its fluid, impossible movements replaying in my mind. The next day, I went back. I had to. Part of me hoped I'd find tracks, some kind of evidence, but another part of me was terrified of what I might discover. The clearing looked exactly the same. No giant footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest the passage of an 8-foot-tall, hairy giant. If it weren't for the vivid, terrifying memory seared into my brain, I might have convinced myself it was all a dream. I've been back to those woods many times since then. Never saw anything like it again, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm out there, I'll catch a whiff of something musky and wild, or I'll hear a twig snap in the distance, and my blood runs cold. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of escaped zoo animal, or a bear with a weird deformity, but deep down, I know that's not true. What I saw that day was something other. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've heard stories, you know. Other hunters, loggers, hikers. Whispered tales of giant creatures in the woods. Most people laugh it off, call it Bigfoot nonsense. But I don't laugh anymore. Not since that day. I still hunt, still spend time in those woods. But I'm always on edge now, always watching the tree line. And sometimes when the light's fading and the shadows grow long, I swear I can see something moving just out of sight. Something big, something fast. I've never told this story before. Who would believe me? But it happened. It was real. And the worst part is, I know it's still out there, waiting, watching. Every time I go into those woods now, I wonder, will this be the day I see it again? And if I do, what will happen? Will it just walk by like before? Or will those intelligent eyes finally lock onto mine? I don't have answers. All I know is that the woods aren't what I thought they were. There are things out there, things we can't explain. And once you've seen them, you can never go back to not knowing. So if you're ever up in Fort St. James, enjoying the wilderness, keep your eyes open. And if you see something moving at the edge of a clearing, something that looks almost human but not quite, don't stick around to get a better look. Run. Run as fast as you can. Because trust me, you don't want to know what's really out there in the dark. Story 25. I was driving through British Columbia with my friends on January 15th, 1969. We were heading north on the highway towards Hope, trying to make it to Vancouver by morning. It was about 3 a.m. and bitterly cold outside, the kind of deep winter chill that seeps into your bones. The road was completely deserted at that hour, nothing but endless dark forest on either side of us. I was at the wheel, fighting to stay awake. My buddies were all passed out in their seats. The heater was blasting, but I could still see my breath inside the car. I kept having to scrape frost off the inside of the windshield. Suddenly, something large stepped out onto the road about 50 yards ahead of us. At first I thought it was a bear, but as we got closer I realized it was walking on 2 legs. My heart started racing. I nudged my friend in the passenger seat awake. "Hey, look at that! What the hell is that thing?" As we approached, I slowed the car down to get a better look. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. It was some kind of creature, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It had grayish fur covering its entire body. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. It had a thick, barrel-shaped torso and a sloping posture, like a cross between an ape and a human. But the thing that really struck me was the way it moved. As our headlights illuminated it, the creature turned to look at us. But it didn't just turn its head. Its entire upper body rotated in one fluid motion, twisting at the waist to face us directly. The movement was so inhuman, so utterly alien. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. For a split second, we locked eyes. Its face was partially hidden in shadow, but I could make out 2 gleaming eyes reflecting our headlights. They seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. Then, in a flash, the creature loped off the road and disappeared into the thick underbrush. I slammed on the brakes, my hands shaking on the wheel. "Did you see that?" I shouted, waking up my other friends. They groggily asked what was going on. I tried to explain what we'd just witnessed, but I was so worked up I could barely get the words out. My friend in the passenger seat was white as a sheet. He nodded vigorously, eyes wide. I saw it too. What the hell was that thing? We sat there in shocked silence for a few minutes, engine idling. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, see if we could find any tracks. But a much bigger part was scared shitless and just wanted to get the hell out of there. Eventually, that part won out. I put the car in gear and we continued on our way, significantly faster than before. The rest of the drive was tense and quiet. We were all wide awake now, scanning the sides of the road for any further sign of the creature. But we didn't see anything else out of the ordinary. When we finally made it to Vancouver, none of us really wanted to talk about what had happened. It was like we were afraid that discussing it would make it more real somehow. We tried to laugh it off, told ourselves it was just a bear or maybe someone in a costume playing a prank. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't true. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. I kept replaying it in my mind, analyzing every detail. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that what we saw that night was something truly extraordinary. I started doing research, reading everything I could find about Sasquatch and Bigfoot sightings. A lot of it seemed pretty far-fetched, but some of the accounts were eerily similar to our experience. The height, the grey fur, the unnaturally long arms, it all matched up. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. Before, I'd always been a pretty skeptical person. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters or any of that stuff. But after coming face to face with something that by all rights shouldn't exist, I realized how little we truly know about the world around us. I became fascinated by cryptozoology and the search for unknown animals. I started going on camping trips in remote areas, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. I never saw anything quite like that night again, but I did have a few strange experiences that I can't fully explain. My friends and I made a pact not to talk about what happened, at least not to people outside our group. We were afraid of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking, but privately we would sometimes discuss that night, trying to make sense of it all. One thing we all agreed on was the profound sense of otherness we felt when we saw the creature. It wasn't just that it was big or scary. There was something fundamentally alien about it, something that didn't fit with our understanding of the natural world. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, it was like encountering something from another dimension. Over the years, I've thought a lot about why that creature was out on the road that night. Was it just passing through? Was it curious about our car? Or was there some other reason it wanted to be seen? I'll probably never know the answers to these questions, but they continue to haunt me. I've heard all the arguments against the existence of Sasquatch. The lack of bodies, the absence of clear photographic evidence, etc., and I understand the skepticism. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night, and it wasn't anything that science can easily explain. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there who have had similar experiences, but are afraid to come forward. How many encounters go unreported because people fear ridicule or doubt? It makes me sad to think that there might be important information out there that's being lost because people are too afraid to speak up. I'm in my 70s now, and I know I don't have many years left. As I get older, I find myself thinking more and more about that night in 1969. I worry that when I'm gone, there will be one less person who can testify to the reality of these creatures. That's part of why I'm finally sharing this story now. To anyone reading this who might be skeptical, I understand. I was once like you. But I urge you to keep an open mind. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation, things that challenge our understanding of what's possible. My encounter with the Sasquatch taught me that lesson in a way I'll never forget. And to anyone who might have had a similar experience, you're not alone. I know how isolating it can feel, how hard it is to make sense of something so outside our normal reality. But I encourage you to share your story, even if it's anonymously like this. The more we can learn about these encounters, the closer we might get to understanding what's really out there. As for me, I still get out into the wilderness as often as I can. And every time I'm in the forest at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, hoping for another glimpse of that mysterious creature. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, but the possibility keeps me going. That brief encounter over 50 years ago opened my eyes to a world of wonder and mystery that I never knew existed. And for that, despite the fear and confusion it caused, I'll always be grateful.